My name is Penelope, and I am 27 years old. 12 years ago, my mother Brenda shoved a screaming newborn into my 15-year-old arms and told me I was dropping out of high school the next morning. My older sister Jessica needed to secure her future. My mother said so. I had to forfeit mine. For 12 years, I raised my niece Emma in a drafty Macomb County duplex. I worked graveyard shifts doing medical billing, clipping coupons, and watering down dish soap, while my mother and sister moved on with their lives. Then last Sunday, a man in a tailored charcoal suit knocked on my rusted screen door, asking for the legal guardian of Emma Hayes. When I stepped forward, he pulled a thick, watermarked file from his leather briefcase. The moment my mother saw the crest on that folder, she went dead pale, lunged across the kitchen, and tried to physically block the doorway with her body. Before I tell you what was in that file and the 12-year betrayal it exposed, please take a second to like and subscribe to Olivia Stories Revenge. But only do it if you believe the truth always finds a way into the light. Drop a comment to let me know how old you are, where you are watching from, and what time it is right now. I love connecting with you all. Now let me take you into that cramped kitchen where my mother's secrets finally collided with reality. It was a typical Sunday afternoon. The duplex smelled of cheap laundry detergent and the faint metallic tang of the radiators. My mother had stopped by for her mandatory monthly dinner, sitting at the laminate table, nursing a can of Vernor's ginger ale. I was standing by the counter pouring myself a mug of black coffee, exhausted from a 50-hour work week. Emma was in her bedroom down the hall listening to music. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the aluminum screen door. I opened the wooden inner door to find a man in his 40s holding a leather briefcase. He did not look like he belonged in our neighborhood. He introduced himself as Thomas Gable, a probate attorney from Bloomfield Hills. He asked to speak with Emma, legal guardian. I told him that was me. He did not smile. He just stepped inside the narrow entryway and stated he was executing an irrevocable generation skipping trust from the estate of Julian Hayes. The name hung in the air. Julian Hayes was an auto parts manufacturing heir, a name I only knew from local news segments. I had no idea what he had to do with my niece, but my mother did. I heard the aluminum pop of the Vernor's can hitting the linoleum floor. Ginger ale sprayed across the baseboards. I turned to see my mother out of her chair. Her face held no color. Her hands were shaking so hard her rings rattled together. Mr. Gable ignored her panic. He looked directly at me and said he needed to verify my identity and see Emma's birth certificate before he could discuss the disbursement of the trust. I moved toward the battered metal filing cabinet in the corner of the living room. My mother lunged forward. She grabbed my wrist. Her fingernails dug into my skin through my cheap sweater. "Do not show him anything, Penelope." Her voice was a frantic hiss. "Tell him to leave right now." I pulled my arm free. My pulse hammered in my ears. I wrenched the bottom drawer of the cabinet open, my hands digging through folders of overdue utility bills and medical statements. I found the blue folder labeled. Emma pulled out the birth certificate and handed it to the lawyer along with my driver license. Gable reviewed the documents. He opened his briefcase and laid a stack of legal papers on my cramped kitchen table. He announced that the trust designated exclusively for Emma held millions of dollars. I did not deliver a calm or collected response. I did not stand tall and demand answers. My fingers went numb. The ceramic mug slipped from my hand and shattered against the linoleum. Hot coffee splashed over my bare ankles, but I barely felt the burn. I stared at the man in the suit, then at my mother, who was now backing away toward the wall, clutching her purse to her chest like a shield. "What the hell are you talking about, Mom?" My voice cracked on the last word. I sounded terrified and small, the pitch of my voice echoing the 15-year-old girl who had her life stripped away in this very same kitchen. Gable frowned, looking between the two of us. He pulled out one more sheet of paper, and what he said next made the air leave my lungs. Thomas Gable adjusted his silver wire-rimmed glasses and pulled a leather-bound ledger from his briefcase. He placed it directly on my kitchen table, right next to a stack of past-due electric bills and a plastic container of generic brand peanut butter. He smoothed the crisp pages of the ledger with his index finger. He did not look at my mother, who was still pressed against the faded floral wallpaper. He looked at me with an expression of deep professional confusion. He let his gaze wander over the peeling linoleum floor, the water stains spreading across the ceiling above the sink and the cracked plastic molding around the window frame. It was clear he was trying to reconcile the poverty of my home with the financial documents resting under his hands. Gable cleared his throat and stated that the Julian Hayes estate had dutifully executed the confidentiality agreement signed 12 years ago. He read the figures aloud in a flat, measured tone that made the numbers sound even more surreal. $2,500. Disbursed on the first of every single month for the past 144 months. Direct deposited into an account registered to Brenda. My chest stopped moving. The air in the cramped kitchen seemed to evaporate. I work 50 hours a week as a medical billing coder. My entire professional life consists of staring at glowing monitors, organizing alphanumeric diagnostic codes, and auditing denied insurance claims. I spend my days fighting with hostile insurance adjusters over $50 copays and arguing about bureaucratic technicalities just to earn a meager hourly wage. Because of my job, my brain is conditioned to process numbers instantly. The math hit me before Gable even finished speaking. 12 years. 12 months a year, $2,500 a month, $360,000. I looked down at my own hands. My knuckles were red, cracked, and dry from washing dishes with cheap, watered-down soap. I stared at my frayed fingernails and remembered every brutal Michigan winter we had endured in this drafty duplex. I remembered the nights the wind rattled the thin window panes so fiercely I had to wrap Emma in 3 layers of sweaters because I could not afford to turn the thermostat above 60 degrees. I remembered crying in the driver's seat of my rust-covered sedan when the alternator died. I had to walk 3 miles through the snow to reach my night shift at the clinic because missing even 1 day of work meant we would not make rent. I remembered the sheer crushing guilt I felt every time Emma brought home a permission slip for a school field trip or asked for a new pair of winter boots. I would stay awake until dawn, recalculating my grocery budget, figuring out how many meals of instant ramen I needed to eat so my niece could have standard necessities. I spent my 20s feeling like a constant failure, drowning under the weight of a responsibility I did not ask for, but accepted out of pure love. I turned my head slowly to look at my mother. She refused to meet my gaze. She stared at the puddle of spilled ginger ale on the floor, her shoulders hunched. Suddenly, a dozen memories snapped into sharp focus, replaying in my mind with sickening clarity. 3 years ago, my mother hired a contractor to install granite countertops and custom cherry wood cabinets in her kitchen. When I asked how she afforded it, she waved her hand and claimed she had been saving her pennies. Last Thanksgiving, she brought a lavish spread of imported cheeses and expensive cuts of meat from a high-end grocer, while I contributed a $10 store-bought pie. She drove a pristine late-model SUV. She wore leather boots that did not leak when it rained. She always dressed in cashmere sweaters and offered me unsolicited advice on how I needed to manage my meager budget better. She used to sit at this very table sipping tea and telling me that hard work builds character, all while she was secretly collecting a fortune that was meant to feed the child I was raising. She sold us out. Julian Hayes was a wealthy heir who had a brief affair with my teenage sister Jessica. When Jessica got pregnant, my mother orchestrated a quiet deal behind closed doors. She took the newborn to protect her older daughter's reputation. She forced me to drop out of 10th grade to change diapers and warm bottles. In exchange, the Hayes family paid her a quiet fortune to ensure Jessica never went to the local press. My mother turned my stolen high school years and Emma's very existence into a monthly paycheck. She collected the hush money every 30 days, and she kept every single cent for herself. Imagine realizing your mother watched you starve to feed a child while she secretly sat on hundreds of thousands of dollars. Imagine knowing the person who gave you life stood by and watched you skip meals so your niece could eat, while her own bank account swelled with stolen wealth. Could you ever look at her the same way? The kitchen walls seemed to lean inward, pressing the oxygen out of the room. The smell of the spilled dark roast coffee mixing with the sticky sweet puddle of ginger ale hit the back of my throat. I did not deliver a calm, articulate speech demanding justice. I did not stand tall and confront my abuser with a sharp, cinematic comeback. The sheer scale of the betrayal bypassed my brain and struck directly at my stomach. A wave of intense nausea surged upward. I clamped a hand over my mouth. I stumbled away from the table, my socks sliding dangerously on the wet linoleum. I barely made it down the narrow hallway. I shoved the bathroom door open, fell to my knees, and gripped the cold porcelain edges of the toilet bowl. I retched hard. My ribs ached as my body tried to expel the sickening reality of my own life. I dry-heaved until my throat burned and my eyes watered, shedding any semblance of dignity. Thomas Gable was just sitting out there in my kitchen in his expensive suit. My mother was standing there watching me fall apart. I wanted to be strong, to be the fierce, protective mother figure Emma needed, but instead I was on my knees on a cheap bath mat, choking on my own revulsion. I stayed on the floor, gasping for air. The cheap fluorescent light above the sink buzzed with a steady, annoying hum. From the kitchen, I could hear Thomas Gable maintaining his measured professional tone. He was asking for clarification regarding the financial tracking of the trust disbursements. Then I heard my mother, frantic, high-pitched voice. She was stammering her words, tumbling over each other in a desperate rush of excuses. She was talking about verbal agreements and the rising cost of living. She was trying to justify the unjustifiable to a man who looked at spreadsheets for a living. I pulled myself up using the edge of the sink. My legs felt hollow. I turned on the cold water and splashed it over my face, letting the freezing temperature shock my system back into focus. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. I looked much older than 27. There were dark, tired circles under my eyes. My hair was tied in a messy knot. I had sacrificed proms and college tours. I had given up dating and friendships to pack school lunches and attend parent-teacher conferences. I had done all of it out of fierce, unconditional love for Emma. But my mother had taken that love and turned it into a lucrative hostage situation. I grabbed a frayed gray towel, dried my face, and walked back out into the hallway. The air in the kitchen was thick with tension. Gable was packing his ledger back into the leather briefcase, his posture stiff and formal. My mother was wringing her hands, her knuckles white with strain. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes as I stepped back into the room. The secret was out on the table, but the reason behind it was still waiting to be spoken. I needed to know how she could justify 12 years of silent theft while watching me struggle to keep the lights on. I needed her to say it out loud in front of the lawyer, in front of God, and in front of me. I leaned against the doorframe and crossed my arms tightly over my chest to hide the lingering tremors in my fingers. She opened her mouth to speak, and what poured out was a defense that dragged us both back to the darkest year of our lives. Thomas Gable snapped the brass locks of his briefcase shut. The metallic click sounded like a judge bringing a wooden gavel down in my quiet kitchen. My mother could not stay to watch him pack his legal documents. She scrambled past the laminate table and followed me into the cramped hallway. Her face was pale and streaked with running mascara. Her breath came in ragged, uneven gasps. I wanted to push her away. I wanted to scream until my vocal cords tore, but the words jammed tight in my throat. She grabbed my forearms with both hands. Her grip was tight and desperate. "You think I wanted to take that money, Penelope?" she choked out. "You think I took those checks because I wanted to buy yachts and luxury cars? You do not understand what was happening back then. You were too young to comprehend the math." My mother raised her voice, the sound echoing off the cheap drywall. She dragged us both back to the nightmare of 2008, the year the economic crash gutted Metro Detroit and bled our working-class neighborhood dry. My father spent 30 years working the line at the Warren Truck Assembly Plant. He worked brutal shifts, installing transmissions coming home every night smelling of industrial grease and sweat. He broke his back for that company so he could secure a union pension. That pension was the sacred promise that was supposed to keep a roof over their heads forever. Then the industry collapsed. The bailouts happened, but the pensions vanished into thin air. My father lost his entire retirement savings overnight. The stress destroyed his heart. He died of a sudden myocardial infarction 6 months later, leaving my mother with a mountain of medical debt and a house she could no longer afford. We were 2 weeks away from foreclosure, my mother cried. Her tears fell freely now, dripping onto the collar of her expensive cashmere sweater. The bank sent final notices. They were going to put our furniture on the street in the middle of a brutal January freeze. When Jessica got pregnant and ran off to Grand Rapids, Julie and Hayes' family offered me a deal. Keep the baby quiet, and they would pay $2,500 a month. What was I supposed to do, Penelope? Let the bank take the house. Let us freeze to death in a homeless shelter. I did it to keep a roof over your head. I bought our survival. I stared at her ruined makeup and trembling shoulders. A heavy, suffocating weight pressed down on my chest. I wanted to hate her with pure, unadulterated clarity. But the memories rushed back thick and undeniable. I remembered the visceral terror of those years. I remembered the neon yellow eviction notices taped to our front door flapping in the bitter winter wind. I remembered wearing 2 pairs of socks to bed because the gas company shut off our heat. I remembered the hollow, defeated look in my father's face before his heart gave out. The trauma of our poverty was not a lie. It was a shared scar that still ached in my bones whenever the temperature dropped outside. Can extreme poverty ever justify stealing a child's future to save the family home? Where do you draw the line between survival and abuse? When does a desperate mother trying to keep her family off the streets transform into a warden holding her own daughter hostage? These questions tore through my mind, making me dizzy. She used that hush money to pay the mortgage. She used my stolen teenage years to keep the bank away. But then the mortgage was paid off, the crisis passed, and the money kept coming. She kept taking the monthly deposits long after the threat of homelessness vanished. She upgraded her kitchen and bought designer boots while I bought Emma winter coats from local thrift stores. The survival instinct had mutated into silent, comfortable greed over a dozen years. I pulled my arms out of her grasp. I gripped my own hair with trembling hands, feeling the roots pull painfully against my scalp. "That does not give you the right to steal my youth," I shouted. But my voice betrayed me. It lacked the polished confidence of a movie heroine. My shout broke into a desperate, wavering sob. I sounded like a wounded child instead of a furious adult. "You stole my prom," I cried. "You stole my college tours. You watched me scrub floors to buy baby formula when you had thousands of dollars sitting in a checking account. You let me think we were still drowning." I wanted to maintain my righteous anger, but my knees felt weak. The psychological messiness of the moment stripped away my pride. My mother was crying openly now, sinking against the hallway wall. We were just 2 broken women standing in a cheap duplex, scarred by an economic disaster that had fractured our family long before the hush money ever arrived. I felt a confusing mix of furious resentment and reluctant grief. I hated her for what she did, but part of me still remembered the terrified widow who did not know how to pay for her husband's funeral. Before my mother could offer another excuse, Thomas Gable cleared his throat. He had stepped out of the kitchen and was standing at the end of the hallway, holding a sleek silver pen and a thick stack of trust documents. His professional demeanor cut through the thick emotional tension like a sharp blade. "This is a difficult family matter," Gable said evenly. "However, my duty is strictly to the estate of Julian Hayes and the beneficiary of the trust. The funds are held in an irrevocable generation, skipping trust designated solely for Emma Hayes. The monthly hush money payments your mother received are separate from this new fortune. This trust holds millions in liquid assets and corporate voting shares. It requires immediate execution to ensure the child is provided for." I wiped my face with the back of my hand, forcing myself to push the complicated grief aside. I stood up straighter and looked the lawyer in the eye. "Emma is my daughter," I said firmly. I raised her. I fed her. I took her to every doctor appointment and sat through every parent-teacher conference. I am her legal guardian. I will take control of the trust to protect her future and ensure nobody ever uses her as a paycheck again. Gable nodded slowly, his expression revealing nothing but procedural calculation. "Very well," he replied. "As the legal guardian, you are entitled to serve as the primary trustee until Emma turns 18. I will just need to verify your standing for the probate court records. Please provide the court-stamped guardianship decree transferring legal custody from Jessica to yourself." I let out a shaky breath of relief. For a moment, I thought the battle was already won. I walked back into the living room and went straight to my battered metal filing cabinet. I pulled out a heavy accordion folder where I kept all of our important life documents. I sifted through the papers until I found the thick packet I had signed when I turned 18. The papers my mother had prepared promising me that everything was official. I pulled the stapled packet out and handed it to Gable with a trembling but triumphant hand. Gable took the paperwork. He adjusted his glasses and scanned the top page. He flipped to the second page, his brow furrowed. He turned the document over, checking the back, and then sighed. A deep, tired sigh of a man who dealt with bureaucratic disasters every single day. He handed the packet back to me. "These are worthless," he said flatly. The word hung in the quiet room. I stared at him, my heart skipping a beat. I asked him what he meant. I told him I signed those papers in front of a notary 9 years ago. "Signing them means nothing if they are never filed with the county court," Gable explained. "This is merely a drafted petition. It lacks a judge signature. It lacks a docket number. According to the state of Michigan, this document does not exist. On paper, your sister Jessica still retains full biological and legal custody of Emma. You have zero legal standing." The floor seemed to drop out from beneath my feet. I looked over at my mother. She was refusing to look at me, staring fixedly at her own expensive leather shoes. She had promised me she filed those papers. She had promised me I was officially Emma Mother. Instead, she had kept me a legal ghost to maintain her own control over the hush money. Without that court-stamped decree, I could not access the trust. And far worse, I had no legal power to stop my estranged sister from walking back into our lives and taking the child I had spent 12 years raising. Thomas Gable stood in the center of my cramped living room, holding the unfiled guardianship petition like it was contaminated. The cheap fluorescent light overhead buzzed softly, filling the suffocating silence. He explained the harsh reality of Michigan probate law with the detached precision of a man reading a weather report. A notarized signature is just ink on a page without a judge ruling. The probate court requires a formal stamped decree to establish legal guardianship. Because my mother never filed the petition 9 years ago, the state viewed me as nothing more than a glorified, unpaid babysitter. I stared at the paperwork in Gable hands. My vision blurred. A cold, terrifying numbness started in my fingertips and spread rapidly up my arms. For 12 years, I had operated under the assumption that I was Emma actual mother in the eyes of the law. I signed her school enrollment forms. I authorized her childhood vaccinations. I stayed up all night rocking her through fevers and ear infections. I did all the grueling, invisible labor of motherhood while believing the legal system recognized my sacrifice. But it was all an illusion built on my mother deceit. Brenda had deliberately kept me a legal ghost. If she had filed the guardianship transfer, she would have had to explain the arrangement to a family court judge. A judge might have asked questions about financial support. A judge might have discovered the offshore hush money flowing from the Julian Hayes estate. To protect her $360,000 secret, my mother ensured I remained completely powerless. On paper, Brenda technically held physical guardianship for the hush money arrangement, while my sister Jessica retained full biological rights. I had absolutely no standing. If a single missing signature stood between you and the child you raised, how far would you go to fight a system designed to ignore you? Imagine discovering that a decade of your sweat tears and unconditional love could be erased by a bureaucratic technicality. I snatched the stapled packet out of Gable's hands. My breathing became ragged and shallow. The sheer magnitude of my helplessness crashed over me like a physical blow. Without legal standing, I could not serve as the trustee to protect Emma Millions. And infinitely worse, I had no legal authority to stop Jessica from walking into my duplex and taking the child I loved more than anything in the world. My hands shook violently. A surge of pure, unadulterated terror bypassed my rational brain. I did not deliver a stoic monologue about fighting the system. I lost control. I gripped the edges of the useless petition and yanked my hands apart. The thick paper tore down the middle with a loud, harsh rip. I tore it again and again. I destroyed the documents in a blind tantrum, letting the shredded pieces fall like snow onto the faded beige carpet. A jagged, broken sob tore from my throat. "You set me up," I choked out, pointing a shaking finger at my mother, who was still cowering near the hallway. "You made me raise her so you could collect a paycheck, and you did not even have the decency to make it legal. You left me with nothing." My mother flinched away from my anger. She opened her mouth to offer another hollow excuse about survival and the 2008 housing crash, but I cut her off with a sharp scream. "Do not say another word. You get out of my house right now. Get out!" Brenda scrambled toward the rusted screen door, grabbing her designer purse with trembling hands. She did not look back as she fled down the cracked concrete steps into the cold Macomb County afternoon. I stood amid the shredded paper chest heaving, trying to force air into my tight lungs. Gable remained perfectly still, watching my messy emotional collapse with professional detachment. He picked up his leather briefcase and cleared his throat. "I understand this is highly distressing, Ms. Penelope. However, the law does not operate on emotion. It operates on documentation. Since you are not the legal guardian, my firm is legally obligated to contact the biological mother regarding the trust execution. We will be notifying Jessica Hayes immediately." He turned and walked out the door, leaving me alone in the suffocating quiet of the duplex. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Jessica, my older sister who ran away to Grand Rapids 12 years ago to escape the reality of teen pregnancy. The sister who married a minor local politician and spent her 30s curating a pristine image for country club fundraisers. Jessica had not seen Emma in 3 years. She sent generic birthday cards with $20 bills tucked inside and called on major holidays, always rushing off the phone after 5 minutes. She viewed Emma as a shameful secret from her past, an inconvenient mistake that our mother had paid me to erase. But everything was about to change. News of a multi-million-dollar trust fund has a way of erasing shame and replacing it with sudden, intense maternal instinct. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of hyper-vigilant panic. I barely slept. I researched cheap family law attorneys online while Emma was at middle school. I tried to shield her from the radioactive anxiety vibrating through our small home. I cooked dinner, checked her math homework, and smiled until my jaw ached, pretending our world was not currently balancing on the edge of a bureaucratic cliff. 2 days later, the inevitable happened. I was standing at the kitchen sink scrubbing a frying pan when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I looked out the window. A pristine late-model luxury SUV pulled into my cramped driveway, dominating the small space. It looked entirely out of place next to my rusted 10-year-old sedan. The driver's side door opened. Jessica stepped out. She wore an expensive camel hair coat and oversized designer sunglasses. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect, effortless waves. She looked like a woman who spent her weekends attending charity galas, not visiting a working-class duplex in Macomb County. She paused by her vehicle, adjusting her coat and looking at my peeling front porch with an expression of thinly veiled distaste. My stomach plummeted. She was not here for a sisterly visit. The probate attorneys had contacted her. The timeline of her arrival was too calculated, too precise. She had driven 3 hours across the state the moment she realized her abandoned daughter was now a trust fund heir. I dried my hands roughly on a dish towel and walked to the front door, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I stepped out onto the porch just as Jessica reached the bottom of the concrete steps. She pulled off her sunglasses and offered me a practiced, sympathetic smile. It was the kind of smile politicians use when shaking hands for a photo op. "Penelope," she said, her voice smooth and polished, "it has been a long time." "What are you doing here, Jessica?" I asked, keeping my voice low so Emma would not hear from her bedroom. Jessica sighed dramatically, placing a manicured hand over her heart. "The lawyers called me yesterday. I was completely shocked about Julian passing and this trust fund business. It is a lot to process, but I realized it is time I stepped up. I am here to take responsibility for our daughter." Our daughter. The phrase made my blood run cold. She had not claimed Emma as her daughter since the day she handed her to me in a hospital blanket. I gripped the wooden railing of the porch to steady myself. The real motive behind her sudden maternal awakening was obvious. but the full scope of her political agenda was far more dangerous than just a simple cash grab. I was about to discover exactly why her husband needed control of that trust, and it had nothing to do with buying Emma a better life. Jessica stood at the bottom of my porch steps, clutching her designer handbag. The crisp winter air carried the faint smell of exhaust fumes and road salt. Her expensive camel hair coat looked like an alien artifact against the backdrop of my peeling vinyl siding and cracked concrete walkway. Grand Rapids money hits different than Macomb County survival. She lived in a world of manicured subdivisions and political fundraisers. I lived in a world where neighbors fought over street parking and worried about winter heating bills. "I am here to take responsibility for our daughter," she repeated, adjusting her perfect blonde waves. Thomas Gable contacted me yesterday regarding the Julian Hayes estate. As Emma's biological mother, it is my duty to step in and manage her future. I gripped the wooden railing. The splinters bit into my palms. My sister had not visited this house in over 3 years. The last time she saw Emma was a brief, awkward lunch at a diner where Jessica spent the entire hour checking her phone and complaining about her husband's campaign schedule. She did not know Emma's favorite color. She did not know Emma was allergic to amoxicillin. She did not know Emma cried when she struggled with long division. "You do not care about her future," I said, my voice low and tight. "You care about the trust fund. You smelled the money from across the state and drove 3 hours to collect a paycheck." Jessica sighed, a performative sound designed to show patience she did not actually possess. "Penelope, please do not make this difficult. Robert and I have discussed this extensively. We have a stable home in Grand Rapids. We have access to the best private schools. Emma deserves to grow up in a proper environment, surrounded by resources you simply cannot provide on a billing coder salary. She was using my poverty as a weapon, the same poverty our mother forced upon me when she made me drop out of high school to raise Jessica Mistake." I felt a hot, dangerous surge of adrenaline flood my chest. "What did Robert tell you to say I snapped? Did your husband write a script for you before you left his campaign headquarters?" Jessica flinched. The mention of Robert struck a nerve. Robert was a minor local politician aggressively campaigning for a Michigan State Senate seat. His entire political brand was built on family values and economic development. Having a secret, abandoned teenage daughter surface during a competitive election cycle would be a public relations nightmare. Unless, of course, that daughter came attached to a multi-million-dollar fortune. "This is not about Robert," she said quickly, her eyes darting away from mine. "This is about doing what is best for Emma. The trust requires a sophisticated trustee." Julian Hayes left behind a very complicated portfolio. It is not just liquid cash, Penelope. There are corporate assets involved. Corporate assets. The phrase hung in the freezing air. My mind raced back to my meeting with Thomas Gable. The probate attorney had mentioned liquid assets and corporate voting shares. At the time, I was too overwhelmed by my mother theft to process the details. But standing on the porch, watching Jessica shift uncomfortably in her expensive boots, the puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. Julian Hayes was an heir to a massive Detroit auto parts supplier. His estate did not just consist of bank accounts. It contained controlling voting shares in a major regional manufacturing corporation, a corporation that employed thousands of union workers across the state of Michigan. "Robert is running for state senate," I said, my voice rising as the realization hit me. "He is struggling to secure the United Auto Workers Union endorsements." Jessica stiffened. Her manicured fingers tightened around her purse strap. "I do not see how my husband's political campaign has anything to do with this family matter." "It has everything to do with it," I shouted, stepping down the porch stairs toward her. "You do not just want the cash, you want the corporate voting shares. If Robert controls Emma Trust, he controls a massive block of shares in a major auto parts supplier. He can leverage those shares to secure union endorsements and buy his way into the state senate. Emma is not a daughter to you. She is a political pawn. Have you ever watched an absent family member suddenly pretend to care only when money and power were on the line? Imagine seeing the person who abandoned your child try to weaponize that child's existence to further their own selfish ambitions." Jessica took a step back, her face flushing angry red. You are being hysterical, Penelope. Robert is a good man. He wants to welcome Emma into our home and give her a real family. We can provide her with opportunities you cannot even dream of. We can protect her future. Protect her." I laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that scraped my throat. "You ran away to Grand Rapids 12 years ago because changing a diaper was too much responsibility. You let Mom pocket $360,000 in hush money while I scrubbed toilets to buy baby formula. You do not know the first thing about protecting her. You have no legal standing." Penelope Jessica countered, her voice turning sharp and authoritative. "Gable told me the guardianship petition was never filed. I am the biological mother. The court will grant me full custody and name me the trustee. You are just a bitter high school dropout who wants to hold on to a meal ticket." The insult broke whatever thin thread of self-control I had left. I did not deliver a stoic, measured response. I did not maintain the moral high ground. The explosive, unpolished rage that had been building inside me for a decade finally detonated. I lunged forward and physically shoved my sister backward. My hands hit the soft cashmere of her coat. Jessica stumbled, her high-heeled boots slipping on the salted concrete of the driveway. She caught her balance against the side of her pristine SUV, her eyes wide with genuine shock. "You do not get to play Mom because there is a voting block attached," I screamed, my voice echoing down the quiet Macomb County street. A neighbor walking their dog stopped and stared. I did not care. I pointed a trembling finger at Jessica's face. "You left her. I raised her. I am her mother. If you try to take her away from me to fund your husband's political campaign, I will burn your entire fake life to the ground." Jessica scrambled to open her car door, humiliated by the public scene. "You are crazy!" she yelled over the roof of the SUV. "Robert lawyers are filing the custody papers tomorrow. We will see how a judge feels about a violent, unstable woman trying to steal a trust fund heir." She slammed the door, started the engine, and threw the car into reverse. The tires spun on the icy driveway before catching traction. I stood shivering in the cold, watching her taillights disappear down the street. The adrenaline faded rapidly, leaving me shaking and sick to my stomach. I had lost my temper. I had resorted to physical violence. I had acted entirely out of raw, messy emotion rather than cold logic, giving Jessica exactly the kind of ammunition her expensive lawyers needed to paint me as unfit. I wrapped my arms around myself and walked slowly back up the porch steps. My chest ached with an oppressive, suffocating fear. Jessica had the money. She had the political connections. She had the biological claim. All I had was a rusted car, a modest paycheck, and a fierce, desperate love for the child sleeping inside. I knew I needed to hire a lawyer immediately. I needed to fight back through the proper legal channels before Jessica erased me from Emma life completely. But what I did not know as I walked back into my drafty duplex was that the fight over custody was about to be sidelined by a much more terrifying threat. The federal government was currently auditing the Hayes estate. The consequences of my mother 12 years of financial fraud were about to catch up with all of us, bringing a bureaucratic nightmare that would freeze the trust and trap us in a desperate race against the IRS. I spent the next morning frantically calling family law attorneys. Most of the offices I contacted required retainer fees that equaled my entire annual salary. I finally found a lawyer working out of a small strip mall office in Warren. His name was Arthur, a tired-looking man with coffee stains on his tie who charged a flat fee I could barely afford by maxing out my only credit card. I sat in his cramped office surrounded by stacks of manila folders, explaining the situation while he typed slowly on an ancient keyboard. He promised to file the emergency custody petition to establish my physical custody rights, but he warned me that fighting Jessica's biological claim and her husband's political resources would be a long, expensive battle. I returned to my duplex that afternoon, feeling a crushing weight pressing down on my chest. I had initiated the legal fight, but I was already running out of ammunition. I was boiling water for cheap pasta when my cell phone vibrated against the laminate counter. The caller ID displayed Thomas Gable office number. I answered, bracing myself for another bureaucratic hurdle. Mr. Gable's voice came through the speaker flat and devoid of any emotional inflection. "Ms. Penelope," he began. I am calling to inform you of a significant complication regarding the Julian Hayes estate. I paused, holding a wooden spoon over the steaming pot. The Internal Revenue Service has officially placed a federal tax lien on the Generation Skipping Trust. All assets, including the liquid cash and the corporate voting shares, are currently frozen. No disbursements can be made to any party until the audit is resolved. The words echoed in my small kitchen. Frozen. Federal tax lien. I asked him why the IRS was auditing a trust meant for a 12-year-old child. Gable sighed, the heavy sound of a professional dealing with a massive, unforced error. The issue does not stem directly from Julian Hayes' passing. The audit was triggered by the discovery of undeclared offshore disbursements. During the routine estate inventory, the federal auditors uncovered the $360,000 paid to your mother, Brenda, over the past 12 years. My stomach plummeted. The hush money. Those monthly payments were classified as non-taxable child support by the Hayes estate. Gable continued. However, Brenda never declared that income on her federal tax returns. By hiding those funds in various accounts to avoid detection, she committed severe tax evasion. The IRS considers the trust and the hush money to be linked assets originating from the same estate. Therefore, they have frozen the entire trust pending a full investigation into Brenda financial fraud. I gripped the edge of the counter. The water in the pot boiled over, hissing angrily as it hit the hot burner. My mother had not just stolen my youth. She had not just stolen 12 years of child support meant for Emma. Her greedy, desperate attempts to hide her stolen wealth from the government had now triggered a federal lockdown on Emma's entire future. Gable stated that navigating an IRS audit involving offshore accounts and generation skipping trusts was a monumental task. The federal investigation would take a minimum of 6 to 8 months. He advised me that any custody battle over the role of trustee would be purely theoretical until the lien was lifted. He ended the call, leaving me standing in the center of my kitchen, holding a dead phone. Imagine fighting for your child's future, only to have the federal government freeze everything because of a crime you did not commit. You sacrifice your entire life to raise a child in poverty, while your own mother hoards hundreds of thousands of dollars. And just when a fortune arrives to secure that child's future, the very theft that kept you poor becomes the reason the fortune is locked behind a federal tax vault. What is your next move? The sheer unfairness of the situation broke me. It was not a quiet, cinematic single tear rolling down my cheek. It was a violent, messy explosion of absolute exhaustion. I screamed a raw, primal sound of pure frustration. I kicked the base of the wooden kitchen cabinet with all my strength. The impact sent a sharp, blinding pain shooting up my leg. I had bruised my toe instantly. I collapsed onto the faded linoleum floor, pulling my knees to my chest. I sat there in my work clothes, sobbing uncontrollably, rubbing my throbbing foot like a petulant child. I had tried so hard to be strong. I had fought my mother. I had fought Jessica. I had maxed out my credit card to hire a lawyer. And now I was fighting the Internal Revenue Service. It felt impossible. It felt like standing at the bottom of the ocean, trying to hold back the tide with a plastic bucket. I cried until my throat ached and my eyes burned. I lay on the cold floor, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the cheap wall clock. The minutes dragged by. The physical pain in my foot slowly grounded me, pulling me out of the spiral of panic. I sat up slowly, wiping my face with the sleeve of my sweater. I looked at the stack of unpaid bills resting on the edge of the table. I looked at the glowing screen of my ancient laptop sitting on the counter. I work 50 hours a week as a medical billing coder. My entire professional existence is dedicated to fighting bureaucratic red tape. I spend my days tracking down alphanumeric diagnostic codes, identifying misclassified billing errors, and arguing with insurance adjusters who deny claims based on obscure technicalities. I know how to read complex financial statements. I know how to spot discrepancies in ledger entries. I know how to navigate massive institutional systems designed to wear people down until they simply give up. A cold, hard focus settled over me, replacing the crushing despair. The IRS was just another massive bureaucracy enforcing a complex set of rules. And rules have structures. Structures have loopholes. I dragged myself off the floor, ignoring the dull throb in my foot. I walked over to the counter and flipped open my laptop. The screen flickered to life. I did not have access to the Hayes estate files, but I had something just as valuable. I knew my mother. I knew how she operated. I knew she was not a sophisticated criminal mastermind. Brenda was a terrified widow trying to hoard cash. She would have made mistakes. She would have left a paper trail. I opened a new spreadsheet. I started typing rapidly, creating columns for dates, amounts, and suspected account transfers. I needed to reconstruct 12 years of Brenda financial history. I needed to map out exactly how she received the $2,500 every month and where she hid it. If I could audit my own mother financial records, if I could track the exact flow of the hush money and identify the specific tax codes she violated, I could build a settlement proposal. I could present the IRS with a clear forensic accounting of the fraud and offer a compromise to separate Brenda tax liability from Emma Trust Fund. I worked through the night. I cross-referenced old bank statements I had saved from the few times my mother asked me to help balance her checkbook. I looked up public property tax records to see when she paid off her mortgage. I researched the specific federal tax penalties for undeclared offshore child support payments. I treated my mother's financial history like a massive denied medical claim. I dug into the alphanumeric codes of the IRS tax manuals, looking for the exact classification errors Brenda had made. By dawn, my eyes were bloodshot and my back ached from hunching over the keyboard. But my spreadsheet was full. I had mapped out a clear timeline of Brenda deception. I had identified the specific offshore holding accounts the Hayes estate likely used to disperse the hush money. I was building the exact tool I needed to bypass the cheap lawyer and force a negotiation directly with Thomas Gable and the federal auditors. I finally closed the laptop as the early morning light filtered through the kitchen window. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. I was not helpless anymore. I had a weapon. But my focused determination was shattered an hour later. The sun was fully up when I heard the creak of the floorboards in the hallway. I turned around and saw 12-year-old Emma standing in the doorway. She was wearing her oversized pajamas, her hair sleep-tousled. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with a devastating mixture of confusion and profound hurt. She had not been asleep. She had been awake all night listening to me argue on the phone with the lawyer. She had heard me screaming about the hush money, the frozen trust, and Jessica political ambitions. The protective bubble I had spent 12 years building around her had just violently popped. The terrible reality of her biological family, true motives, was now standing naked in the harsh morning light, and I had absolutely no idea how to explain it to her without breaking her heart completely. The morning sun filtered through the frosted glass of my kitchen window, casting long, pale shadows across the linoleum. My ancient laptop sat open on the counter, humming loudly as it struggled to process the heavy spreadsheet I had built overnight. I held my cell phone wedged between my ear and my shoulder, pouring my fourth cup of black coffee. Arthur, the cheap family lawyer I hired in Warren, was on the other end of the line. I paced the narrow length of the kitchen. Adrenaline and severe sleep deprivation stripped away my usual caution. I spoke loud and fast, rattling off the forensic audit I had pieced together while the rest of the neighborhood slept. I tracked the routing numbers, Arthur, I said, pulling up a new tab on my screen. Brenda did not just hide the hush money under a mattress. She funneled it through a secondary checking account and used it to pay off the primary mortgage on her house in 2010. Then she used the rest to artificially inflate her lifestyle. The IRS placed the lien on the trust because those monthly payments were structured as offshore disbursements from the Julian Hayes estate. If we can prove Brenda acted as an unauthorized rogue agent, we can sever Emma from the tax penalty. Arthur sighed heavily over the speaker. His voice sounded thick with morning congestion. That is a steep hill to climb, Penelope. The federal auditors do not care about family drama. They care about unpaid taxes, and we still have Jessica to deal with. Her husband's lawyers filed a formal intent to claim the trust this morning. I scoffed, my voice rising in pitch. Robert does not care about raising a daughter. Julian Hayes held controlling corporate shares in the region's largest auto parts supplier. Robert is running for state senate. He needs those voting shares to secure the union endorsements. Jessica drove here pretending to be a savior, but she just wants the voting block. This whole thing is a transactional game to them. Brenda treated this kid like a monthly mortgage payment, and Jessica is treating her like a political campaign donation. Emma is just a commodity to these people. I hit the enter key on my keyboard to save the file. The sharp clack of the plastic key echoed in the small room, but it was not the only sound. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. The sound was soft tentative, the kind of noise someone makes when they are trying to retreat without being noticed. I turned around. My breath caught in my throat. Emma stood in the doorway leading to the hall. She wore oversized flannel pajama pants and a faded gray sweatshirt. Her bare feet shifted awkwardly on the carpet threshold. She held a glass of water in her right hand. Her knuckles were white. I do not know how long she had been standing there. I do not know how much she had heard, but looking at her pale face, I knew it was enough. 12 is a brutal age. You are old enough to understand the mechanics of the adult world, but still young enough to expect the people who created you to love you. Emma had spent her childhood asking why her real mother lived 3 hours away in Grand Rapids. I used to spin elaborate, gentle stories to protect her. I told her Jessica had an important, demanding job. I told her Jessica loved her very much, but simply was not ready to be a parent. I built a fragile, protective bubble around her origin story to ensure she never felt unwanted. In less than 3 minutes of careless phone conversation, I had taken a needle to that bubble and shattered it. I lowered the phone from my ear. I ended the call with Arthur without saying goodbye. The device felt heavy and useless in my hand. I set it on the counter next to my coffee mug. Emma. I started taking a slow step forward. Her name sounded foreign on my tongue. She did not move. Her eyes were wide and brimming with a devastating mixture of profound hurt and sudden terrifying clarity. The innocent confusion she usually carried was gone, replaced by the crushing realization of her own origin. "Did Grandma get paid to keep me?" she asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. It did not carry any anger. It only carried the fragile, hollow tone of a child watching her entire reality collapse. I froze. My mind raced, searching for a lie, a deflection, any kind of parental shield I could throw up to protect her. But the spreadsheet was glowing right there on the screen. The numbers were real. The audit was real. "Emma, it is complicated," I stammered. I raised my hands in a placating gesture. She took a step back. The water in her glass trembled, spilling a few drops onto the carpet. "And Jessica," she continued, her voice catching on the name, "she does not want me to live with her. She just wants to use me for an election." I felt a physical pain radiate through my chest. The guilt of my own carelessness struck me like a physical blow. I stepped out of the kitchen, reaching for her. "No, sweetheart, please listen to me. That is just how lawyers talk. It is just legal maneuvering." Emma shook her head. A single tear escaped, tracking a shining line down her cheek. "You said they treated me like a commodity. You said I was just a mortgage payment." She did not wait for my answer. She turned and ran down the short hallway. The sound of her bare feet slapping against the floorboards was followed immediately by the heavy slam of her bedroom door. The sharp metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the quiet duplex. I rushed down the hall. I grabbed the brass doorknob and twisted it. It held firm. I knocked on the painted wood, pressing my forehead against the cool surface. Please open the door," I pleaded. I heard the muffled sound of her crying on the other side. It was not a loud, childish tantrum. It was the quiet, stifled weeping of someone who feels entirely alone in the world. I knocked again, harder this time. I needed to say the right thing. I needed to be the perfect cinematic mother figure who delivers a heartwarming monologue that patches the broken pieces back together. I needed to tell her that her worth was not defined by the people who abandoned her. But I was running on zero sleep. My brain was fried from hours of staring at tax codes and routing numbers. The adrenaline that fueled my phone call with Arthur had completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, bone-deep fatigue. I opened my mouth, but the eloquent, comforting words simply were not there. "It is not like that," I said through the thin wood. My voice sounded flat and unconvincing even to my own ears. "You are not a paycheck. You are my daughter. I love you." The crying on the other side of the door did not stop. It did not even slow down. My words felt cheap and inadequate compared to the brutal financial truths she had just uncovered. I had spent 12 years fighting to keep her fed, clothed, and safe, but in the one moment she needed emotional rescue, my exhaustion betrayed me. I had nothing left to give. How do you explain to a child that their biological family viewed their existence as a financial transaction? How do you soften the blow of knowing your grandmother assigned a dollar value to your life and your mother viewed you as a political stepping stone? There is no gentle way to frame that reality. I slumped against the doorframe. My legs gave out. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the hallway floor, pulling my knees to my chest. I rested my head on my arms and closed my eyes. The silence in the duplex felt oppressive, broken only by the faint sound of Emma weeping on the other side of the door. I cried silently into my knees. I wept for the loss of her innocence. I wept for my own profound failure to protect her heart. I had audited the bank accounts and analyzed the legal strategies, but I had neglected the most vulnerable part of the entire situation. I was a medical billing coder trying to play a high-stakes legal game, and my inexperience was causing collateral damage I could not repair. We sat like that for a long time, separated by an inch of wood and a chasm of newly discovered trauma. The air in the hallway grew cold. I lifted my head and looked toward the small window at the end of the hall. The sky outside had turned a bruised, heavy purple. Fat white flakes of snow were beginning to fall, sticking to the cracked pavement of the driveway. The weather forecast had warned of an incoming Michigan blizzard. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. The four walls of the duplex felt like a tightening trap. Staying in this house, surrounded by the paperwork, the spreadsheets, and the ghosts of my mother betrayal, was suffocating us both. The tension was toxic. I needed to get Emma out of this room. I needed to break the awful silence settling over us. I stood up slowly, my joints aching from the hard floor. I knocked on the door one more time gently. "Put your boots on, Em," I said, forcing a steady, even tone I did not actually feel. "We cannot stay in here right now. We are going for a drive." 5 minutes passed before I heard the click of the deadbolt. The bedroom door opened slowly. Emma stood there wearing her heavy winter coat, her scarf wrapped tight around her neck. Her face was blotchy and red. She did not look at me. She just walked past me down the hall toward the front door. I grabbed my keys and my worn parka, following her out into the freezing afternoon. The Michigan winter had arrived with brutal force. The sky above Macomb County was a flat, heavy gray. Snow fell in thick, wet clumps piling up on the rusted hood of my 10-year-old sedan. I scraped the ice off the windshield with numb fingers, the scraping sound harsh and loud in the quiet neighborhood. We climbed into the cold car. The engine sputtered, whining in protest before finally turning over. The heater blew frigid air against our shins. We pulled out of the driveway and headed toward Interstate 75. The roads were already treacherous. Salt trucks had laid down thick layers of brine, turning the snow into a greasy gray slush that kicked up onto the windshield. The wipers thumped back and forth in a steady, hypnotic rhythm, smearing the salt into white arcs across the glass. I merged onto the highway, keeping my speed low. The traffic was a crawl of brake lights glowing red through the blinding snow. The space inside the car felt thick and heavy. Emma stared out the passenger window, watching the snow blur the landscape. She held her hands tucked deep inside her coat pockets. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles stark white. The sheer weight of the last 48 hours pressed down on my shoulders. I was fighting my mother, my sister, a high-powered Grand Rapids politician, and the Internal Revenue Service. I was operating on 3 hours of sleep and a maxed-out credit card. I was fighting a war I had no resources to win. And as the tires slipped slightly on a patch of black ice, a terrible, selfish thought crept into the back of my mind. It was a dark, insidious whisper that I usually managed to suppress. What if I just stopped fighting? What if I let Jessica win the custody battle? Jessica had the pristine SUV, the giant house in Grand Rapids, the political connections. She had the money to pay the federal tax penalties. If I just stepped aside and let her take Emma, the crushing pressure would end. I would not have to fight the probate court. I would not have to audit my mother's financial crimes. I could sleep through the night. I could finally have my 20s back. Staring through the salty windshield, my mind dragged me backward in time. I was 15 years old, sitting at the identical laminate kitchen table in my mother house. It was late May. The air was thick and humid. I held a heavy manila envelope in my hands. It was an acceptance letter to a prestigious out-of-state summer science program, a full scholarship for promising high school sophomores. It was my ticket out of Macomb County. But in the background, a newborn baby wailed from a cheap plastic bassinet. The crying was relentless, piercing, demanding. My mother Brenda stood over me holding a stack of past due bills. "Jessica has a future," Brenda had said, her voice hard and unforgiving. "Jessica needs to marry well to save us. You are dropping out tomorrow." I looked at the acceptance letter, the golden seal printed at the top. I felt the future slipping through my fingers. I folded the heavy paper in half. Then I tore it down the middle. I tore it again into quarters, letting the pieces fall into the trash can. I sacrificed my youth right there in the kitchen while that colicky infant screamed. The memory faded, replaced by the thump of the windshield wipers. The heater in the sedan finally began to blow warm air, but I felt cold down to my bones. The sheer exhaustion eroded the filter between my brain and my mouth. The dark, selfish thought I had been fighting pushed its way past my lips before I could stop it. "It would be so easy," I whispered. My voice was raspy, barely audible over the hum of the tires on the slushy pavement. I was talking to myself, but the enclosed space of the car magnified the sound. If I just let her take you, I could walk away. I could have my life back. The moment the words left my mouth, a wave of profound, sickening regret washed over me. I froze. I stopped breathing. I had just voiced my deepest resentment, my most shameful desire to abandon my responsibilities, right in front of the child I had sworn to protect. I braced myself for Emma to unbuckle her seatbelt, to scream, to demand I pull over, and let her out into the snowstorm. I had just confirmed her worst fear. I had just proven that her existence was a burden to everyone, even to me. But Emma did not scream. She did not cry. The car remained quiet save for the rushing wind outside. Then I saw movement from the passenger seat. Emma pulled her hand out of her coat pocket. She reached toward the center console. Her small fingers found the dial for the heater. She turned it up one notch, adjusting the flow of warm air toward my shivering hands on the steering wheel. She leaned back against her seat and rested her head against the cold glass of the window. "I do not want their money," Emma said softly. Her voice lacked the dramatic anger of a teenager. It possessed the quiet, grounded wisdom of a child who had seen the ugly truth of the world and made her choice anyway. "I just want to stay with you." The simple statement hit me harder than any screaming match could have. It broke right through the thick armor of my exhaustion. Have you ever felt so exhausted by family drama that you seriously considered walking away from the person you love most? Have you ever felt the guilt of resenting the burden you carry, only to have that burden reach out and offer you grace? Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, hot and sudden. I blinked them away, keeping my gaze locked on the treacherous highway ahead. Emma did not care about the generation skipping trust. She did not care about the corporate voting shares or the political campaigns in Grand Rapids. She knew I was broken, tired, and deeply flawed, but she chose me over a pristine life funded by dead man money. The bond we forged in that drafty duplex over 12 years of struggle was stronger than biology and stronger than federal tax liens. I reached across the center console and rested my hand on top of hers. She did not pull away. Her fingers wrapped around mine, holding on tight as the snowstorm raged around our beat-up sedan. I took a deep, shaky breath. The dark, selfish urge to surrender evaporated, replaced by a renewed, hardened resolve. I was not going to give up my daughter to a politician looking for union endorsements. I was going to fight Jessica. I was going to fight the federal government, and I was going to fight my own mother, if that is what it took. but raw determination alone does not win custody battles. As I guided the car off the interstate and headed back toward our neighborhood, I knew the real war was about to begin. The warmth in the car was a temporary sanctuary. Tomorrow morning we had to face the cold, unforgiving reality of the Macomb County legal system. I had to step into a courtroom wearing a discount store blazer and convince a cynical judge that my 12 years of undocumented sacrifice outweighed the biological rights of a wealthy political wife who could afford a team of ruthless attorneys. The bureaucratic machine was waiting to grind us down, and I had no idea if my flimsy legal defense would survive the first hearing. The Macomb County Courthouse did not look like the pristine oak-paneled courtrooms you see in legal television dramas. It was a brutalist concrete building with water-stained ceiling tiles, flickering fluorescent lights, and scuffed linoleum floors that smelled faintly of industrial floor wax and old coffee. I sat on a hard wooden bench outside Courtroom 4, gripping a manila folder so tightly my knuckles ached. Emma was safely at school. Arthur, the cheap family lawyer I hired with my maxed-out credit card, sat next to me scrolling through his phone. He wore a rumpled gray suit and smelled like stale cigarette smoke. I was terrified. I had spent the last 3 nights awake sick with anxiety. Jessica's husband Robert was a connected Grand Rapids politician running for state senate. I was convinced he had pulled strings behind the scenes. I imagined dark backroom deals, campaign donations, exchanging hands, and a judge who had already decided to hand Emma over to further Robert's political ambitions. I kept scanning the crowded hallway, waiting for some corrupt political operative to appear. Then the heavy wooden doors swung open, and the bailiff called our case. We walked into the courtroom. The judge was a woman in her late 50s named Honorable Davis. She did not look corrupt. She looked profoundly exhausted. She had a stack of files 2 feet high on her desk, and she flipped through them with the hurried mechanical efficiency of a factory worker on an assembly line. This was not a grand political conspiracy. This was just a Tuesday morning in a clogged family court docket. Jessica sat at the respondent table. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and pearl earrings. She looked calm, poised, and every inch the responsible, affluent mother. Flanking her were 2 attorneys in custom-fit suits. Their briefcases were sleek leather. Their posture radiated the kind of arrogant confidence that only comes with billing $500 an hour. Arthur patted my shoulder and told me to just follow his lead. His attempt at reassurance only made my stomach twist tighter into a knot. The hearing began. Jessica-led attorney stood up. He did not yell. He did not act malicious or aggressive. He spoke in a smooth, reasonable tone that made his devastating arguments sound like simple logic. "Your Honor," he began, "we are here to correct a prolonged, temporary arrangement. My client, Jessica Hayes, is the biological mother. She temporarily placed her child in the care of her extended family to establish stability. Now she is married, resides in a substantial home in Grand Rapids, and is fully prepared to assume her maternal duties. Furthermore, we must address the recent establishment of the Julian Hayes Trust." The lawyer paused, letting the weight of the millions hang in the air. He gestured toward me. "The petitioner. Penelope dropped out of high school at 15. She currently resides in a cramped rental property and works an entry-level billing job. She possesses no legal guardianship paperwork. We submit that Penelope lacks the financial literacy, the educational background, and the legal standing to properly manage the upbringing of a trust fund heir. The child belongs with her biological mother, who has the resources to provide a suitable environment. Every word was a calculated strike designed to highlight my poverty and my lack of formal education. He weaponized the sacrifices I made against me. Does the legal system truly favor the person who did the hard work, or the person who can afford the most articulate lawyers? When the facts of your life are read aloud in a sterile courtroom by a man wearing a Rolex, 12 years of unconditional love sounds like a severe disadvantage. Judge Davis looked over her reading glasses at Arthur. "Counsel, your client has no filed guardianship decree. What is your legal basis for emergency custody?" Arthur stood up, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, my client has maintained physical custody for 12 years. We are claiming de facto guardianship based on the established status quo." Judge Davis frowned. She turned her gaze to me. "Mom," she said, her voice flat and bored, "you are claiming you raised this child exclusively. Provide the court with a summary of your caregiving responsibilities." This was my moment. This was the scene in the movie where the scrappy underdog stands up, delivers a brilliant, impassioned monologue, and leaves the courtroom in awed silence. I stood up. I smoothed the lapels of my discount store blazer. I opened my manila folder, but my hands were shaking. The notes I had scribbled at 2 a.m. were a disorganized mess. I looked at the judge, then at Jessica's smug attorneys, and my brain short-circuited. The imposter syndrome crushed me. I felt like a fraud, a poor high school dropout pretending to be a mother. I took her to the doctor. I started. My voice cracked. It sounded shrill and defensive. I paid for her braces. I worked night shifts. Jessica never sent any money. Jessica has not seen her in 3 years. She does not even know Emma's shoe size. I fumbled with my papers, dropping a medical receipt onto the floor. I bent down to pick it up, my face burning with humiliation. I stood back up, losing my train of thought completely. "She is my daughter," I blurted out. She is my niece, but I am her mom. Jessica just wants the voting shares in the trust. She wants to use Emma for a political campaign." Judge Davis raised her hand, cutting me off. "Ma'am, please stick to the facts regarding caregiving. I am not interested in family drama or political conspiracy theories." I closed my mouth, my cheeks flushing hot red. I had completely failed. I sounded erratic, paranoid, and disorganized. I lacked the polished confidence I desperately needed. Jessica lawyers looked at each other with subtle, satisfied smirks. I sank back into my hard wooden chair, feeling entirely inadequate. The fear of political corruption had been a massive red herring. I had wasted my energy worrying about bribes and backroom deals, blinding myself to the actual threat. The real danger was the cold, unfeeling bureaucracy of the legal system itself, a system that prioritized proper paperwork and biological claims over 12 years of undocumented sacrifice. Judge Davis reviewed the files for another agonizing 60 seconds. She stamped a document with a heavy thud. "I am granting temporary physical custody to the petitioner Penelope, based strictly on the established status quo," Judge Davis announced. "Removing a 12-year-old from her primary residence abruptly would cause undue harm. However, I will not sever the biological mother legal rights without a full evidentiary trial. Given the substantial financial assets involved with the trust, we need a complete forensic review. Trial is set for 90 days. The judge banged her gavel and immediately called the next case. Arthur leaned over and whispered that we survived the first round. He sounded relieved. I did not feel relieved. I felt like I had just barely avoided a fatal car crash, only to realize my brakes were still cut. I had temporary custody, but Jessica still held all her legal rights. The judge had made it clear that my lack of formal education and missing paperwork were massive liabilities. We walked out of the courtroom into the crowded, noisy hallway. Jessica and her attorneys breezed past us. Jessica did not even look in my direction. She walked with the easy, arrogant stride of a woman who knew she had the upper hand. I leaned against the cool concrete wall of the corridor, feeling the adrenaline drain from my body, leaving me hollow and sick. I had 90 days to prove I was a fit mother against a team of lawyers who specialized in tearing people like me apart. I needed more than just a disorganized folder of medical receipts. I needed a weapon that could destroy Jessica's pristine narrative and prove that her biological claim was built on a foundation of abandonment and theft. I needed a star witness. Star. The realization hit me with a sickening twist in my gut. There was only one person who knew exactly how the hush money was arranged. Only one person who could testify under oath that Jessica had willingly abandoned Emma to protect her own reputation 12 years ago. Only one person who possessed the physical proof of the financial fraud that trapped us all. I pushed off the concrete wall, my heart sinking as the grim reality of my situation set in. I was going to have to do the one thing I swore I would never do again. I was going to have to walk into my mother house and confront the very woman who had stolen my youth. I needed Brenda to testify in court. I needed to force the woman who had hoarded $360,000 in secret to stand before a judge and confess to her own crimes. And I knew Brenda would fight like a cornered animal to protect her own pride and her remaining wealth. The battle in the courtroom was paused for 90 days, but the battle in my mother-hoarded living room was about to begin. I drove straight from the Macomb County courthouse to my mother house. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel of my rusted sedan. The adrenaline from the hearing had burned off, leaving a cold, sharp determination in its place. I needed Brenda. I needed her to stand in front of Judge Davis and confess that Jessica had willingly abandoned Emma. I needed her to admit that the entire guardianship arrangement was a financial scheme designed to protect Jessica's reputation and keep the hush money flowing. I knew asking a woman who had spent 12 years hiding a fortune to publicly incinerate her own pride was a dangerous gamble. I expected a vicious argument. I expected her to deny everything, to scream about survival and the auto industry crash, to lock the door and refuse to help me. I was prepared for a fight. I parked on the street and marched up the cracked concrete walkway. I did not bother knocking. I used the spare key I kept on my ring, turned the deadbolt, and pushed the heavy wooden front door open. "Mom," I shouted, stepping into the dim foyer. "We need to talk right now." No answer. The house was quiet. The air smelled stale, a mixture of old dust and the faint, lingering scent of the expensive imported coffee she liked to buy. The curtains in the living room were drawn tight, blocking out the pale afternoon sun. I walked past the kitchen with its gleaming granite countertops and custom cherry wood cabinets. The physical evidence of her stolen wealth mocked me. I turned the corner into the living room, bracing myself for a confrontation, but I stopped dead in my tracks. The angry words died in my throat. The living room was in chaos. It was not the organized, immaculate space my mother usually maintained. The furniture had been pushed against the walls. In the center of the plush carpet sat 4 large cardboard boxes. They looked old, and water damaged the kind of boxes you shove into the back of an attic and forget about for a decade. Brenda sat on the floor amid the cardboard. She was not wearing her usual cashmere sweater or her designer boots. She wore a faded, oversized t-shirt and sweatpants. Her hair was unkempt. She looked small, frail, and entirely stripped of her usual arrogant armor. Spread out across the carpet around her were dozens of items I had not seen in over a decade. I took a slow, hesitant step forward. My breath caught in my chest. Lying near the coffee table was a charcoal sketch of the Detroit skyline I had drawn for an art class when I was 14. Next to it was a stack of glossy college brochures from state universities I had requested by mail before I was forced to drop out. There were blue ribbons from middle school science fairs. There was a plaster mold of my hand I had made in 3rd grade. She had kept them. She had kept all the physical evidence of the future I was supposed to have. She had boxed up my ambitions, taped them shut, and hidden them away while she forced me to raise a newborn. Brenda held a tarnished silver medal in her hands. It was the award I won at the regional debate tournament the semester before Emma was born. She was weeping. Not the manipulative, performative tears she used to win arguments. This was a quiet, ragged weeping that shook her narrow shoulders. "I stole your whole life," Brenda choked out without looking up. Her voice was raspy and broken. I stood frozen near the entryway. The script in my head, the demands for her testimony, the righteous anger I had fueled on the drive over it all, evaporated. The psychological reality of the moment was far too messy for a clean, cinematic confrontation. "I was so terrified of losing this house," Brenda whispered, tracing the edge of the silver medal with a trembling finger. "When your father died, I felt the ground open up underneath me. The bank was calling every day. The eviction notices were taped to the door. I could not sleep. I could not breathe. I was drowning in fear. And when the Hayes family offered the money, I grabbed it like a life raft." She finally looked up at me. Her eyes were red and swollen. "I grabbed the money to save the house, and I did not care that I was drowning you to do it. I convinced myself I was making a noble sacrifice for the family. But I knew. I always knew what I took from you, Penelope. I kept these boxes because I could not bear to throw away the girl you were supposed to be." When a toxic parent finally admits the horrific damage they caused, does a genuine apology actually fix the past? Can a moment of raw, pathetic honesty erase 12 years of stolen youth, watered-down dish soap, and bone-deep exhaustion? The answer is no. An apology does not rewrite history. It does not refund the years or heal the trauma. But witnessing the architect of your suffering admit her own villainy changes the shape of the pain. It removes the gaslighting. It validates the suffering. I wanted to maintain my fury. I wanted to yell at her for hoarding the hush money long after the threat of foreclosure had passed. I wanted to scream that her guilt did not buy me groceries when I was 19 and terrified. But looking at her sitting on the floor surrounded by the ghosts of my lost high school years, I could not muster the hatred. I did not feel vindicated. I just felt an overwhelming, heavy sorrow. Brenda was not a cartoon villain plotting my demise. She was a deeply broken woman crippled by financial trauma whose survival instincts had mutated into a silent, comfortable cruelty. I walked slowly into the center of the room. My legs felt heavy. I knelt down on the carpet near the scattered college brochures. The air between us felt fragile. I reached out awkwardly. My hand hovered in the air for a second before I placed it gently on her trembling shoulder. I patted her arm in a stiff, ungraceful gesture. I was comforting the very person who had abused me. It was an imperfect, messy moment. It proved that breaking trauma bonds is not a clean process. You can hate what someone did to you while still feeling a reluctant, pathetic pity for their brokenness. "Mom," I said quietly. My voice sounded exhausted. "You keeping these boxes does not fix what happened. You cannot apologize your way out of 12 years. I know," Brenda sobbed, leaning slightly into my touch. "I know I cannot fix it." I pulled my hand back, resting it in my lap. I looked at the charcoal sketch on the floor, then back at her tear-stained face. "I do not need your apologies right now," I told her, my tone shifting back to the grim reality of the present. "I need your testimony. I need you to stand up in that courtroom in 90 days and tell the judge the truth. I need you to confess under oath that Jessica abandoned Emma willingly to protect her reputation. I need you to admit the guardianship petition was a sham to hide the hush money." Brenda stopped crying. She stared at me, her eyes widening as the implications of my demand sank in. "Penelope, if I confess to that under oath," she whispered, her voice trembling with a new kind of fear, "the judge will report the fraud. The IRS will audit me. They could seize the house. They could take everything I have left. I could face criminal charges for tax evasion." I stood up, brushing the dust off my discount store blazer. I looked down at the woman who had traded my future for her financial security. "I know," I said coldly. "But you just said you knew what you took from me. Now I am asking you to pay it back. You sacrificed me to save this house 12 years ago. Now you have to sacrifice the house to save Emma. If you do not testify, Jessica will take her to Grand Rapids. Robert will use the trust voting shares to buy a Senate seat. And Emma will spend the rest of her life knowing she is nothing but a political pawn." I turned and walked toward the foyer, leaving the scattered high school memories on the carpet. "You have 90 days to decide what kind of mother you actually are," I called out without looking back. I walked out the front door and closed it firmly behind me. The cold Michigan air hit my face, bringing a sharp, stinging clarity. I had issued the ultimatum. I had demanded Brenda immolate her own life to protect mine. But relying on a desperate hoarder to do the right thing was a massive risk. I could not afford to sit back and hope my mother found her moral courage. I needed to prepare for the very real possibility that Brenda would panic and refuse to testify to save her own skin. As I walked back to my rusted sedan, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. It was a text message from Emma. She rarely texted me during school hours, unless there was an emergency. I unlocked the screen, my heart rate instantly spiking. The message read, "She is here. She is waiting by the cafeteria. She wants me to leave with her." My blood ran cold. While I was confronting Brenda in her dark living room, Jessica had bypassed the lawyers and the court system entirely. My sister had driven straight to Emma Middle School in Macomb County, launching a direct, desperate ambush to isolate the child she needed for her husband's political campaign. And I was miles away. I threw my rusted sedan into gear and slammed my foot on the gas pedal. The tires spun on the icy street before gripping the pavement. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The drive from my mother house to the middle school usually took 20 minutes. I made it in 12, ignoring speed limits and taking sharp corners that made the worn suspension of my car groan in protest. Emma's text message burned in my mind. She is here. She wants me to leave with her. Jessica was not playing by the rules. The judge in Macomb County had granted me temporary physical custody. Jessica attorneys knew that attempting to remove Emma from the school grounds without my permission was a direct violation of the court order. But Jessica was acting out of desperation. Her husband's political campaign needed control of those corporate voting shares locked inside the Julian Hayes Trust. She needed Emma to willingly choose the affluent life in Grand Rapids to strengthen her biological claim before the trial. I pulled into the school parking lot, slamming the gear shift into park. I did not bother grabbing my coat. I sprinted through the freezing wind toward the main entrance. The heavy double doors were locked for security. I buzzed the front office, my finger shaking as I held the button down. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Can I help you? I am Penelope," I shouted into the speaker. "I am Emma Guardian. Where is she?" The buzzer sounded, and the door clicked open. I burst into the brightly lit administrative office. The school secretary, a woman I had spoken to dozens of times over the years to excuse absences and update medical files, looked up from her desk with wide, alarmed eyes. "Where is Emma?" I demanded, leaning over the laminate counter. "Penelope, calm down," the secretary said, her voice attempting to soothe my escalating panic. "A woman claiming to be her biological mother arrived 30 minutes ago during the lunch period. She showed us her driver license. Since she is listed on the birth certificate, we could not legally stop her from signing Emma out for an off-campus lunch. They went to the coffee shop across the street. She promised to have Emma back before 5th period. I did not wait to hear the rest of the explanation. I spun around and bolted back out the double doors. The bitter cold hit my face, but I barely felt it. I sprinted across the snow-covered parking lot, dodging a delivery truck, and jaywalked across the busy 4-lane avenue, dividing the school from a small commercial strip mall. The local coffee shop was a popular hangout for middle schoolers and teachers. The large glass windows at the front of the store were fogged with condensation from the heat inside. I grabbed the metal door handle and yanked it open. The bell above the door chimed loudly, cutting through the low murmur of conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine. Several students sitting at tables near the entrance turned to look at me. I scanned the crowded room. I spotted them immediately. They were sitting in a corner booth near the back. Jessica wore her pristine camel hair coat draped elegantly over the back of her wooden chair. She was leaning forward across the small circular table, gesturing animatedly with her manicured hands. Emma sat opposite her, pressed firmly against the back of the vinyl booth. She still wore her heavy winter parka, zipped all the way to her chin. Her posture radiated sheer terror. She looked like a hostage trying to make herself as small as possible. Emma's hands were hidden beneath the table, likely clutching her cell phone where she had desperately texted me for rescue. On the table between them sat a pristine white shopping bag with a silver Apple logo stamped on the side. A brand new iPhone box peeked out from the tissue paper. Next to the bag were glossy brochures featuring photographs of European castles and prestigious preparatory schools with manicured green lawns. Have you ever witnessed someone try to buy affection that they never took the time to actually earn? Imagine watching a stranger offer the world to a child they abandoned, believing that flashy electronics and expensive vacations can instantly replace 12 years of steady, unconditional care. I did not take a deep breath to compose myself. I did not strategize a calm, icy takedown designed to make me look like the superior, mature adult. The explosive, unpolished rage that had been simmering inside me since the meeting with Thomas Gable finally boiled over. The sight of Jessica trying to purchase the daughter I had sacrificed my youth to raise triggered a fierce, primal maternal protectiveness that bypassed every filter of social decency. I marched across the coffee shop. My heavy boots thudded against the hardwood floor. I reached their table and slammed both my hands flat onto the wooden surface. The coffee cups rattled. The glossy European brochures slid onto the floor. "Get away from her!" I yelled. My voice was not controlled. It cracked on the final syllable, loud and wavering, echoing off the exposed brick walls of the cafe. Every customer in the room went dead silent. The barista stopped steaming milk. A group of Emma classmates sitting 2 tables away stared at us with wide, terrified eyes. Jessica jumped in her seat, startled by my sudden appearance. She quickly regained her composure, smoothing the front of her expensive silk blouse. "Penelope," she said, offering a tight, patronizing smile. "Please lower your voice. You are making a scene. We are just having a mother-daughter lunch to discuss her future." She gestured gracefully toward the white shopping bag on the table. "I was just telling Emma about the amazing opportunities Robert and I can provide in Grand Rapids. The private academies, the summer trips to Paris. We can finally be a real family." I pointed a trembling finger directly in Jessica's face. My hand shook so badly, the gesture lost its intimidation factor. "You do not get to buy her love with dead man money when you could not even buy her diapers," I shouted. I stepped closer to the table, my hip aggressively bumping one of the empty wooden chairs. The chair tipped backward and crashed onto the floor with a loud, startling bang. The noise made several customers flinch. I did not bother to pick it up. I ignored the public spectacle I was causing. I let my rage override my dignity completely. "You ran away, Jessica." I continued, my voice raw and loud in the silent room. "You dumped her in my arms when I was 15 years old because you did not want the responsibility. You let Mom hoard the hush money while I worked night shifts. You do not know her favorite color. You do not know she hates the crust on her sandwiches. You are not a mother. You are a political campaign manager trying to secure a voting bloc." Jessica's face flushed a deep, humiliating red. She glanced nervously around the room, acutely aware of the staring audience. Her polished facade cracked under the weight of the public exposure. "Penelope, stop it," she hissed, leaning forward. "You are embarrassing yourself. You sound unhinged. Look at how you are behaving in front of her friends." I did not care about her friends. I did not care about the staring baristas or the judgmental whispers starting to ripple through the cafe. I looked at Emma. Her face was pale, but her eyes were locked onto mine with an expression of immense, profound relief. The terror that had gripped her posture was gone. She knew I had come for her. I reached my hand across the table. "Let us go, Em," I said, my voice dropping an octave, softening only for her. Emma did not hesitate. She slid out of the vinyl booth, completely ignoring the expensive white shopping bag and the glossy brochures left on the table. She grabbed my hand, her small fingers wrapping tightly around mine. Jessica stood up quickly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "Emma, wait," she pleaded, her voice tinged with genuine desperation. "You belong with me. I can give you everything you ever wanted." Emma stopped near the shattered remains of the coffee shop piece. She turned her head and looked directly at the woman who birthed her, the biological mother offering her a fortune built on abandonment. "I already have everything I want," Emma said quietly. Her voice did not waver. She squeezed my hand. We turned and stormed out of the coffee shop together. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully behind us, a stark contrast to the heavy, dramatic exit. We walked quickly across the icy parking lot back toward my rusted sedan. The cold air hit my face rapidly, cooling my flushed cheeks. The adrenaline that had fueled my explosive confrontation began to recede, leaving behind a sharp, stinging sense of embarrassment. I had caused a messy, loud scene in front of Emma Pierce. I had acted exactly like the unhinged, unstable woman Jessica's expensive lawyers had described in the Macomb County courthouse. I had let my emotions dictate my actions, and in the brutal arena of family court emotional outbursts, our weapons handed directly to the opposition. I unlocked the car and we climbed inside. The interior was freezing. I leaned my forehead against the cold steering wheel, closing my eyes and taking a deep, shaky breath. I felt the heavy burden of my own imperfection. I was a flawed, exhausted 27-year-old trying to navigate a billionaire estate and a ruthless political machine. But as I sat there shivering, I realized the clumsy public spectacle had accomplished one vital thing. Jessica's attempt to isolate Emma and buy her loyalty with shiny gifts had completely backfired. By witnessing Jessica's transactional approach to motherhood, Emma's fear of her biological mother was now cemented. The shiny illusion of Grand Rapids was shattered. Emma knew exactly who Jessica was, and more importantly, Emma knew who I was. But my momentary sense of victory was short-lived. As I started the engine, my cell phone buzzed loudly in the center console. It was a text message from Thomas Gable, the probate attorney. The message consisted of 2 brief sentences that made my blood run cold. The Internal Revenue Service has proposed a settlement regarding the tax lien on the Julian Hayes Trust. We require an emergency meeting at my office immediately. The federal government had finally made its move. The massive bureaucracy that had frozen Emma's future was offering a path out of the lockdown. But dealing with the IRS is never a simple transaction. They do not offer settlements out of the goodness of their hearts. They demand payment, and the brutal reality of how that payment was going to be extracted would force me into an agonizing moral compromise. I was about to discover that freeing Emma Fortune required me to use the very money meant for her future to bail out the woman who had stolen my past. Thomas Gable office in Bloomfield Hills smelled of expensive leather and lemon polish. The massive mahogany desk dominated the room, its polished surface reflecting the muted gray light filtering through the large windows. I sat in a stiff leather chair opposite the desk. Emma was waiting in the reception area, doing her homework under the watchful eye of a paralegal. My cheap family lawyer Arthur sat next to me looking decidedly out of place amid the wealthy trappings of the probate firm. Gable steepled his fingers, resting his chin on his hands. He looked at the thick stack of financial documents resting on his desk, my spreadsheet. The forensic audit I had compiled during a sleepless night of panic sat on top of the pile. I must admit, Ms. Penelope Gable began, his voice maintaining its usual measured cadence. Your analysis of your mother financial routing was remarkably thorough. It provided the exact leverage we needed to open a dialogue with the Internal Revenue Service investigators. I did not smile at the compliment. As a medical billing coder, I had spent my entire professional life finding the buried alphanumeric errors that held up necessary treatments. Applying that skill to unearth Brenda 12 years of offshore hush money transfers was just another tedious, frustrating day at the office. The federal auditors reviewed the data. Gable continued. They acknowledge that the trust itself is a separate legal entity from the undeclared income your mother hoarded. They are willing to partially lift the lien on the generation's skipping trust. I felt a surge of relief push against the tight knot of anxiety in my chest. We could unfreeze the funds. We could finally access the resources necessary to hire a high-powered legal team to fight Jessica and her husband political machine in the upcoming custody trial. However, Gable said, raising a finger to halt my optimism, there is always a however when dealing with federal tax enforcement. The IRS requires immediate restitution for the 12 years of tax evasion, he explained. They demand the back taxes, the accumulated interest, and the substantial punitive penalties for the offshore fraud. The total sum is staggering. Because the hush money originated from the Julian Hayes estate, the IRS has stipulated a brutal condition for the settlement. To release the trust, the estate must formally authorize the seizure of Brenda assets to cover the deficit. The air in the office went still. I stared at Gable, trying to process the magnitude of the legal maneuver. What assets? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Gable adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses. Everything, Ms. Penelope. The federal government will place a direct lien on her bank accounts. They will garnish any remaining pension funds, and most significantly, they will seize her primary residence to auction for the remaining balance. The house. The very same house Brenda had sacrificed my entire future to save. The poetic justice hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow. The irony was so thick it was hard to breathe. In 2008, my mother was terrified of losing that house to the bank. She forced me to drop out of high school, thrust a screaming newborn into my arms, and stole my youth just to secure the hush money that paid the mortgage. She hoarded the extra cash for over a decade, upgrading the kitchen with granite countertops and buying designer boots while I bought winter coats from thrift stores. She destroyed my life to keep a roof over her head. And now, because she hoarded that stolen wealth and committed federal tax fraud, the government was going to take the house anyway. Her brutal survival tactics, her silent, comfortable greed, it had all been for absolutely nothing. She was going to end up exactly where she feared she would be 14 years ago, homeless and bankrupt. I felt a dark, twisted knot of vindication tighten in my gut, but it was quickly swallowed by a deep, bitter resentment. Would you authorize the seizure of your childhood home just to finally gain access to your child's future? Would you sign the paperwork that formally initiates the financial ruin of your own mother? If we do not agree to this settlement, I asked, my voice flat and pragmatic, what happens to the trust? Gable sighed, a heavy sound of professional resignation. The lien remains in place. The funds stay frozen indefinitely. The federal investigation could take years to resolve through the standard audit process. You would have no financial resources to fight Jessica in the custody trial 90 days from now. I looked at Arthur. He offered a grim, silent nod. It was the only viable path forward. I had to sacrifice Brenda to save Emma. I had to use the very money meant for my daughter's future to pay the toll for my mother's crimes. It was a sick, twisted transaction that left a foul taste in my mouth. I had fought so hard to escape the gravitational pull of my mother's financial abuse, and yet here I was signing away her life just to survive the fallout. Give me the paperwork, I said, extending a trembling hand across the mahogany desk. Gable slid a thick packet of legal documents toward me. He handed me a sleek, heavy silver pen. I stared at the signature line. The paper felt heavy, loaded with the weight of 12 years of resentment. I thought about the torn acceptance letter to the summer science program. I thought about the eviction notices flapping in the winter wind. I thought about Brenda sitting on her living room floor, weeping over the boxed-up remnants of my stolen high school years. She had finally admitted her guilt. She had finally shown genuine remorse. But remorse does not pay the IRS. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name. The ink flowed smoothly black and final. I signed the second page authorizing the estate to cooperate with the federal asset seizure. I signed the third page officially initiating the foreclosure process on the house I grew up in. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel like a victor in a hard-fought battle. I felt angry. I was furious at the incredible unfairness of a system that forced me to clean up the mess my mother and sister had created. I was furious that Brenda's survival instincts were still dictating the terms of my life. I finished the final signature. I grabbed the sleek silver pen tight in my fist. The bitter, resentful pragmatism boiled over. I did not maintain my cool, composed exterior. I did not offer a polite thank you to the attorney. I let my frustration shatter the quiet professional atmosphere of the Bloomfield Hills office. I threw the pen. I hurled it across the massive mahogany desk with a sudden violent jerk of my arm. The heavy silver pen struck the far edge of the desk, bounced off a framed family photograph, and clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. Arthur jumped in his seat, startled by the outburst. Gable simply raised an eyebrow, his expression carefully neutral, watching my imperfect, messy reaction. "This is garbage," I yelled, my voice harsh and cracking. 12 years she steals from us. 12 years she lives comfortably while I work night shifts. And now I have to sign the papers to make her homeless just so I can afford to fight my sister in court. I am bailing her out of federal prison and she is losing the house anyway. It is all so incredibly stupid. I buried my face in my hands, rubbing my eyes aggressively until I saw stars. I took several deep, ragged breaths, trying to force the anger back down into the tight box where I usually kept it. "I am sorry," I mumbled into my palms, deeply embarrassed by the childish display. I let my hands drop to my lap. I stared at the fallen pen resting near the baseboard. "I will pick that up. Leave it," Gable said quietly. His voice had lost its rigid, formal edge. It sounded tired and surprisingly human. "I have seen clients throw much heavier objects for much smaller injustices, Ms. Penelope. You have secured the release of the trust. The funds will be available by the end of the week. You can now retain adequate legal counsel for the upcoming trial." I nodded slowly, the grim reality of the next step settling heavily on my shoulders. I had unlocked the fortune, but I had paid a devastating price. Brenda was going to lose everything. The IRS would move swiftly, freezing her accounts and posting the foreclosure notices. I would have to tell her what I had done. I would have to look the woman who raised me in the eye and explain that I had authorized her financial ruin. But as I stood up from the leather chair, a new, more terrifying thought struck me. The custody trial was looming. Jessica's expensive Grand Rapids lawyers were preparing to annihilate my character in court. I had the money to hire a better attorney, but money alone does not win a trial against biological rights. I still needed Brenda. I needed the very woman I had just condemned to homelessness to take the witness stand and testify under oath. I needed her to confess to the hush money, the tax fraud, and the emotional manipulation in front of a judge. I needed her to publicly immolate her own reputation to save me. Why would Brenda ever agree to help me now? I had just signed the warrant for her destruction. The battle for Emma was no longer just about legal standing or financial resources. It was going to hinge entirely on whether a broken, terrified hoarder could find the moral courage to sacrifice herself for the daughter she had already destroyed. The Macomb County courthouse was freezing. The industrial air conditioning blasted through the vents above the spectator gallery, dropping the temperature in the large wood-paneled room to an uncomfortable chill. I sat at the petitioner table next to my new attorney, a seasoned family law litigator named Marcus Webb, whom I had hired using the newly unfrozen trust funds. I wore a tailored navy suit that actually fit a stark contrast to the discount store blazer I had worn during the emergency hearing 3 months ago. My hands were folded tightly in my lap to hide the fact that they were trembling. The final custody trial for Emma Hayes had arrived. The next few hours would permanently decide the trajectory of our lives. Across the aisle, Jessica sat with her legal team. She looked immaculate in a cream-colored dress and a single strand of pearls. Her husband Robert, the minor local politician with ambitions of a state Senate seat, sat directly behind her in the first row of the gallery. He kept checking his expensive watch, radiating the impatient energy of a man who believed this entire proceeding was just a minor bureaucratic hurdle on his path to securing the corporate voting shares locked inside the Julian Hayes estate. Judge Davis sat high on her elevated bench, flipping through a thick stack of manila folders with a weary expression. She called the court to order. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the room swung shut with a loud definitive thud. Jessica led attorney, the man in the custom-fit suit who had humiliated me during the first hearing, stood up. He smoothed his tie and addressed the judge with smooth, practiced confidence. He announced that the respondent would call their first witness to establish the biological mother fitness and the extended family support structure. The respondent calls Brenda to the stand. I stopped breathing. The air in my lungs turned to ice. I had not spoken to my mother since the day I signed the IRS settlement papers authorizing the seizure of her house. I had sent Marcus Webb to inform her of the impending foreclosure and the tax fraud investigation. I had no idea what her response had been. I did not know if she was furious, terrified, or simply broken. I had spent the last 3 months terrified that she would take the witness stand and lie. I expected her to side with Jessica. Jessica represented the affluent, successful image Brenda had always craved. Jessica was married to a politician. Jessica offered social status and a return to the comfortable, pristine life Brenda so desperately wanted to maintain. Siding with me meant siding with the daughter who had just initiated her financial ruin. If forced to testify under oath, do you think a toxic parent would protect their image or finally tell the truth to save you? Brenda walked through the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. She moved slowly, her steps hesitant and unsteady. The woman who walked down the center aisle looked nothing like the arrogant matriarch who used to host Thanksgiving dinners while bragging about her kitchen renovations. She was not wearing her cashmere sweaters or designer boots. She wore a simple faded cardigan over a plain blouse. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, practical knot. She looked small, frail, and entirely stripped of her former pride. She looked like a woman who had already lost everything. She stepped into the witness box and raised her right hand. The bailiff swore her in. She sat down, her hands gripping the polished oak railing in front of her. Her knuckles turned white. Jessica Attorney approached the podium. He offered Brenda a warm, sympathetic smile, clearly expecting her to deliver a rehearsed narrative that painted Jessica as a loving mother who had temporarily placed her child in a stable family environment. "Please state your relationship to the parties involved," the lawyer began. "I am the mother of Jessica and Penelope," Brenda said. Her voice was raspy, barely carrying across the large, quiet courtroom. "And I am the grandmother of Emma." The lawyer nodded encouragingly. "Brenda, can you describe the arrangement made 12 years ago regarding Emma's upbringing? Did Jessica express a desire to ensure her daughter was raised in a stable, loving home while she established her career?" Brenda looked at the lawyer. She looked at Jessica, who offered a tight, encouraging nod. Then Brenda turned her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes were red-rimmed and heavy with exhaustion. The memory of the scattered high school art projects on her living room floor flashed through my mind. "No," Brenda said flatly. The single syllable echoed in the silent courtroom. Jessica's smile faltered. The lawyer blinked momentarily, thrown off his script. "Excuse me," the lawyer said, leaning closer to the microphone. "Can you clarify that statement?" Brenda took a deep, shaky breath. Her hands trembled on the oak railing. She leaned forward, speaking clearly into the microphone. Jessica did not make a stable arrangement for her daughter. Jessica got pregnant by a wealthy auto parts heir, and she ran away to Grand Rapids to avoid the scandal. She abandoned the baby because she wanted to marry a politician, and a secret child would have ruined her reputation. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face flushing dark red. The lawyer raised a hand, attempting to regain control of his witness. "Brenda, please let us stick to the facts of the caregiving situation. You stepped in to help raise the child, correct?" "I did not step in." Brenda continued, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a sudden desperate need to finally speak the ugly truth aloud. "I orchestrated a cover-up. The Hayes family approached me. They offered to pay $2,500 a month in hush money to ensure the pregnancy never made the local papers. I took the deal. I took the money to pay my mortgage." The lawyer's face drained of color. He looked back at his co-counsel, panic flashing in his eyes. "Objection, Your Honor," he stammered. "This narrative strays from the scope of the custody evaluation." "Overruled," Judge Davis said sharply, leaning forward on her bench, suddenly very interested in the testimony. "Continue the witness." Brenda gripped the railing tighter. Tears began to spill down her cheeks, ruining whatever thin facade of composure she had left. "I took the hush money every month for 12 years, she confessed. "I hid it in offshore accounts. I committed federal tax fraud to keep the money a secret. I upgraded my house and bought expensive clothes while my youngest daughter struggled to buy groceries." She turned her gaze back to me. The raw, profound guilt in her eyes was agonizing to witness. "I did not raise," Emma Brenda choked out a ragged sob, tearing from her throat. "I forced Penelope to do it. I shoved a screaming newborn into my 15-year-old daughter's arms and forced her to drop out of high school. I stole Penelope Youth her education and her future just so I could collect a monthly paycheck and protect Jessica's pristine image. Jessica never sent a dime. Jessica never visited. Penelope did all the work. Penelope is the only mother that child has ever known." The courtroom was stunned into absolute silence. The only sound was the hum of the industrial air conditioning and the soft, desperate weeping of my mother on the witness stand. I could not maintain a stoic, professional exterior. The brutal public exposure of our family sins was overwhelming. Hearing the architect of my suffering publicly immolate her own reputation, confessing to federal crimes under oath in an open court, broke the tight knot of anxiety I had carried for over a decade. I slumped forward in my chair, pressing a hand over my mouth. I visibly flinched as the weight of her confession settled over the room. Hot tears spilled over my eyelashes. I cried openly in the gallery, the messy, ungraceful tears of a woman who had finally been vindicated at the cost of her mother destruction. Jessica's attorney stood frozen at the podium. He had called a witness expecting a supportive ally, and instead he had detonated a bomb that destroyed his client's entire case. He had no follow-up questions. He simply muttered, "No further questions, Your Honor," and retreated to his table looking entirely defeated. Brenda had sacrificed everything. By confessing to the financial fraud under oath, she had virtually guaranteed a swift, brutal prosecution by the IRS. She had publicly humiliated the Grand Rapids politician sitting in the front row, permanently severing any relationship she had left with Jessica. She had thrown herself onto the legal sword to right a 12-year wrong. It was a staggering display of antagonist depth. She was a deeply flawed, toxic woman who had committed horrific acts of selfish greed, but in the final agonizing moment she had found the moral courage to protect me. Judge Davis stared down at the witness box, her expression severe. "You understand the implications of what you have just stated under oath, Brenda." "I do, Your Honor," Brenda whispered, wiping her face with the back of her trembling hand. "I have already lost my house to the federal lien. I have lost everything. Telling the truth is the only thing I have left." The judge nodded slowly. "You may step down." Brenda stood up on shaky legs. She walked slowly out of the witness box, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor. She did not look at Jessica, who was staring straight ahead with an expression of pure, unadulterated fury. Brenda walked past my table. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, offering a small, pathetic nod in my direction, before continuing down the center aisle and out the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. She exited my life completely, leaving the wreckage of her confession behind for the judge to process. Marcus Webb leaned over to me and placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. He did not say anything, allowing me a moment to compose myself. I sat up straight, wiping the tears from my cheeks with a tissue. The worst was over. The truth was out. But the trial was not finished. Jessica still possessed biological rights, and a judge still needed to formally rule on the fitness of the mother. Judge Davis directed her attention to the respondent table. She looked at Jessica with an expression of barely concealed disdain. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted drastically. The polished, affluent facade of the Grand Rapids political wife had been stripped away, exposing the selfish, negligent reality underneath. "I would like to hear from the biological mother directly." Judge Davis announced, her voice ringing with judicial authority. "Jessica, please take the stand. We have a few specific questions regarding your fitness to assume custody of this child." Jessica stood up slowly. The arrogant confidence she had carried into the courtroom earlier that morning had completely evaporated. She walked toward the witness box with the hesitant, stiff posture of someone walking to an execution. The massive inheritance she and her husband desperately wanted was slipping through their fingers, but the final devastating blow was not going to come from a complex legal argument or a forensic financial audit. It was going to come from a simple, brutal quiz about the daily, grueling reality of motherhood. Jessica stepped into the witness box. Her expensive camel hair coat and perfectly styled blonde waves offered no protection against the chilling atmosphere of the courtroom. The confident, affluent aura she had weaponized against me outside the coffee shop was gone. She sat down, her hands folded primly in her lap, but her knuckles were white. Behind her in the gallery, her husband Robert sat rigid, staring straight ahead with an expression of barely contained fury. The political campaign he had built on family values was currently bleeding out on the polished oak floor of the Macomb County courthouse. Judge Davis did not wait for Jessica attorneys to begin their redirect. The judge leaned forward, resting her forearms on the elevated bench. She flipped open a thick manila file that Marcus Webb had submitted into evidence earlier that morning. It was not a file detailing offshore trust accounts or corporate voting shares. It was a simple binder documenting 12 years of routine pediatric care. "Ma'am, Judge Davis," began, her voice carrying a sharp, no-nonsense edge, "you are petitioning this court to sever the established physical custody arrangement and grant you full legal control over a 12-year-old child and her substantial financial assets. You claim to be fully prepared to assume all maternal responsibilities." "I am, Your Honor," Jessica said. Her voice was thin and reedy, lacking conviction. "Robert and I have a stable home. We are ready to integrate Emma into our lives." The judge nodded slowly, her expression revealing profound skepticism. "Very well. Let us discuss the practical application of those maternal responsibilities. According to the medical records provided to this court, Emma was diagnosed with pediatric asthma at age 7. She requires a daily maintenance inhaler and emergency rescue medication." Judge Davis looked over her reading glasses, staring directly at Jessica. Ma'am, can you tell the court the specific name of Emma Daily Maintenance Inhaler? Jessica blinked. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at her attorney, who was suddenly very interested in the legal pad resting on his table. She looked back at the judge. I am sure I could check the prescription bottle. Your Honor, she stammered. I am sure you could, Judge Davis replied flatly. But I am asking you. A child with asthma requires a caregiver who knows the medication protocols by heart. Let us try another question. What is the standard pharmacy copay for her emergency rescue inhaler, and what is the primary insurance diagnostic billing code required to ensure the prescription is authorized without delay during a severe respiratory event? The silence in the courtroom was agonizing. It stretched on for 10 seconds, then 20. The hum of the industrial air conditioning seemed to grow louder. Jessica stared blankly at her manicured hands resting on the oak railing. The polished facade of the wealthy political wife completely shattered under the weight of a simple, mundane parenting question. She did not know the answer. She had never stood in line at a fluorescent-lit pharmacy arguing with an insurance provider while holding a wheezing, terrified child. She had never recalculated her grocery budget to ensure she had enough cash to cover a sudden medical copay. She had abandoned the grueling, invisible labor of motherhood 12 years ago, and now her ignorance was exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the legal system. The silence stretched further, suffocating and heavy. I leaned forward in my chair. My discount store blazer felt tight across my shoulders. The exhaustion of the past 12 years, the thousands of hours spent navigating bureaucratic red tape, as a medical billing coder suddenly crystallized into a weapon of undeniable authority. I did not raise my hand. I did not wait for permission to speak. Fluticasone propionate, I said clearly, my voice ringing out across the quiet courtroom. That is the daily maintenance inhaler. The emergency rescue is albuterol sulfate. The standard copay under our current state plan is $15. I did not stop there. The alphanumeric sequences I spent 50 hours a week staring at on glowing monitors flowed from my memory with practiced automatic precision. The primary insurance diagnostic billing code for moderate persistent pediatric asthma is J45.40. I continued locking eyes with the judge. You must include the secondary modifier code Z23 to indicate the routine pediatric checkup, or the claim will be automatically denied by the regional carrier, leaving you with a $400 out-of-pocket charge at the pharmacy counter. Judge Davis looked at me, a flicker of genuine respect softening her severe expression. She checked the medical file open on her desk, verifying the information I had just rattled off from memory. She closed the folder with a definitive snap. She turned her gaze back to the witness box. Jessica was weeping. The tears were not manipulative or performative. They were the messy, humiliating tears of genuine, profound shame. The reality of her own negligence had finally pierced the thick bubble of her affluent denial. She could not buy her way out of this failure with dead man money. I do not know, Jessica whispered into the microphone, her voice breaking. She lifted a shaking finger and pointed across the aisle at the petitioner table. She pointed directly at me. She knows. It was a messy, ungraceful surrender. There was no dramatic, cinematic outburst. There was no final, desperate legal argument from her high-priced attorneys. There was just a broken woman admitting defeat in front of a judge, a gallery of strangers, and a husband who was already calculating the political fallout of the public embarrassment. Judge Davis picked up her wooden gavel. Based on the compelling testimony provided today and the overwhelming evidence demonstrating a complete lack of maternal involvement by the biological mother, I am ruling in favor of the petitioner. I hereby permanently sever the biological rights of Jessica Hayes. I grant full legal and physical custody to Penelope. Furthermore, the court officially recognizes Penelope as the sole managing trustee of the Julian Hayes Generation Skipping Trust. The gavel struck the sounding block with a loud, sharp crack. Court is adjourned. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the room swung open. The bailiff began clearing the gallery. Jessica stood up slowly, wiping her ruined makeup with the back of her hand. She did not look at her husband, who was already marching out of the courtroom without waiting for her. She walked down the center aisle, a silent, defeated ghost retreating back to Grand Rapids to face the wreckage of her marriage. Marcus Webb leaned over to me, offering a warm, congratulatory smile. "We won, Penelope. It is over. You protected her." I should have felt a massive surge of triumphant joy. I should have jumped out of my chair, hugged my attorney, and celebrated the multi-million-dollar victory that secured my daughter's future. This was the moment the scrappy underdog finally defeated the wealthy, corrupt establishment. This was the ultimate payoff for 12 years of stolen youth and grinding poverty. But I did not celebrate. I slumped forward, resting my elbows heavily on the defense table. I buried my face in my folded arms. My body felt incredibly heavy, drained of all adrenaline and righteous anger. The victory felt hollow, coated in a thick layer of profound grief. Is it possible to win a life-changing legal battle and still feel an overwhelming sense of grief for the person you defeated? I had won custody of the child I loved more than breathing. I had secured a financial fortune that meant I would never have to water down dish soap or panic over a heating bill again. But achieving that security required the total public destruction of my own family. I had authorized the financial ruin of the mother who raised me. I had forced the sister who shared my childhood bedroom to publicly confess her deepest shame on a witness stand. I had burned my family tree down to the roots to keep Emma safe. It was the right choice. It was the only choice. But surviving a fire still leaves you standing in the ashes. I stayed slumped over the table, breathing in the smell of lemon polish and old paper. The courtroom emptied around me. I felt the quiet, solid presence of Marcus Webb standing nearby, giving me the space to process the complicated emotional fallout. The battle against Jessica and Brenda was definitively over. The legal threats had been neutralized. But the transition from a life of desperate poverty to a life of immense wealth is not a magical cure for trauma. Inheriting a fortune brings its own massive logistical burdens. I was about to discover that executing a multi-million-dollar trust requires navigating a mountain of dense, boring paperwork. The dramatic courtroom victory was going to be immediately followed by the mundane, tedious reality of signing my name to financial documents that would officially change the trajectory of our lives forever. The transition from poverty to immense wealth does not happen with a dramatic fanfare or a sudden shower of gold coins. It happens in quiet, sterile rooms, accompanied by the scratch of expensive pens on watermarked paper. It is an excruciatingly slow process, governed by tax codes, fiduciary responsibilities, and endless bureaucratic verification. A week after the custody trial, I drove Emma to Thomas Gable office in Bloomfield Hills. The Michigan winter was finally beginning to break. The thick piles of dirty gray snow along the roadside were melting into muddy puddles, revealing patches of brown, dormant grass underneath. The air smelled of wet asphalt and thawing earth. I did not drive a brand-new luxury SUV. I was still driving the rusted 10-year-old sedan with the squeaky alternator. The trust funds were officially unfrozen, but accessing millions of dollars requires establishing secure corporate accounts, routing numbers, and a dedicated team of financial advisors. Wealth is a machine that takes time to turn on. We rode the silent elevator to the 14th floor. Emma wore her favorite faded gray sweatshirt and jeans. I wore the same navy blue blazer I had worn to court. Neither of us looked like trust fund inheritors. We looked like exactly who we were. Two working-class survivors from Macomb County trying to navigate an entirely foreign world. But I did bring one thing to mark the occasion. Resting on my lap was a grease-stained pink cardboard box from a local bakery in Hamtramck. When the hardest battle of your life is finally over, does victory feel like a movie ending? Do the credits roll while triumphant music swells in the background? Or does victory feel like a quiet, tired moment, sitting in a leather chair, staring at a stack of legal documents that will dictate the rest of your life? Gable sat behind his massive mahogany desk, sorting through a mountain of paperwork. The documents were separated by neon sticky tabs, indicating where signatures and initials were required. He looked up as we entered, his professional demeanor firmly in place, but a faint trace of genuine warmth softened the corners of his eyes. "Good morning, Miss Penelope." "Emma," he said, gesturing to the stiff leather chairs opposite his desk. "Please sit. We have a substantial amount of administrative work to complete today." I set the pink cardboard box down on the polished mahogany surface. The grease from the bottom of the box immediately threatened to stain the expensive wood. Gable raised a silver eyebrow, looking at the box with polite confusion. "I stopped in Hamtramck on the way here," I explained, flipping the cardboard lid open. Inside sat half a dozen massive fried pastries coated in thick layers of powdered sugar and stuffed with raspberry jelly and custard. They were paczki. In Metro Detroit, paczki are a cultural institution. They are traditionally eaten on Fat Tuesday, the day before the severe religious fasting of Lent begins. They represent absolute sugary indulgence. They are heavy, messy, and wonderfully excessive. For 12 years, my entire life had been a forced Lenten sacrifice. I had fasted from my own youth. I had given up proms, college, dating, and financial security to raise the child sitting next to me. I had survived on watered-down dish soap and constant gnawing anxiety. The period of brutal sacrifice was officially over. It was finally time to indulge. "Take one, Mr. Gable," I insisted, pushing the box closer to him. "It is a celebration." The typically stiff, formal probate attorney looked at the greasy pastries. He looked at me, taking in the tired but genuine smile on my face. To my absolute surprise, he reached into the box. He carefully extracted a raspberry-filled paczki, mindful of his crisp white dress shirt. He took a bite, chewed slowly, and smiled. "These are excellent," he said, wiping a dusting of sugar from his chin with a linen napkin. "Thank you. Now let us finalize the transfer of the estate." The next hour was a grueling exercise in bureaucratic endurance. Gable explained the complexities of the generation-skipping trust in excruciating detail. He outlined the dividend yields from the corporate voting shares in the auto parts supplier. He discussed the tax implications of the monthly disbursements and the fiduciary restrictions placed on the principal balance until Emma reached the age of 25. Emma sat beside me quietly, eating a custard-filled paczki. She swung her legs, kicking her worn sneakers against the base of her chair. She was 12 years old, holding the rights to a fortune she could not possibly comprehend. She was more interested in the pastry than the millions of dollars being transferred into her name. Finally, Gable slid the thickest document toward us. "This is the master execution agreement," he said, tapping a neon yellow tab. "This formally establishes Penelope as the sole managing trustee and legally transfers the assets into the designated holding accounts for the beneficiary. Emma, I will need your signature on the bottom line acknowledging the establishment of the trust. Penelope, I will need your signature directly above hers." He handed Emma a sleek, heavy silver pen, the same kind of pen I had thrown across the room in a fit of bitter resentment weeks earlier. Emma took the pen. Her small fingers gripped the silver barrel tightly. She carefully signed her name on the indicated line. Her handwriting was slightly wobbly, the cursive letters looping unevenly across the thick, watermarked paper. She set the pen down and pushed the document toward me. I picked up the pen. The silver metal felt cold against my skin. I looked down at the signature line. Penelope Hayes, guardian and trustee. A sudden, intense wave of emotion crashed over me. It was not joy or triumph. It was a profound, staggering realization of the journey that had brought me to this exact chair. I was 15 years old, crying in a drafty kitchen, holding a colicky infant. I was 19, staring at eviction notices. I was 25, working graveyard shifts, auditing medical claims to buy winter boots. I had fought a ruthless Grand Rapids politician, outmaneuvered the Internal Revenue Service, and survived the crushing betrayal of my own mother. I had won. The war was over. The future was secure. I pressed the tip of the pen to the paper. My hand began to shake. The tremors started in my wrist and traveled down to my fingertips. The adrenaline that had sustained me for months was completely gone, leaving behind a raw, exhausted vulnerability. I tried to steady my hand, gripping the pen tighter, but the shaking only worsened. I signed my name. The ink flowed onto the page, but my signature was a jagged, messy scrawl. My trembling hand slipped on the final letter, causing the heavy blue ink to smear across the pristine white paper. A thick blue smudge ruined the immaculate legal document. I stared at the smear. I was finalizing the transfer of a multi-million-dollar fortune, and I could not even manage a clean signature. I felt a sudden, absurd spike of embarrassment. I had ruined the official paperwork. "I am so sorry," I mumbled, reaching quickly to wipe the wet ink with the side of my hand. I only succeeded in smearing the blue ink across my own palm. I wiped my face in frustration, transferring a streak of blue ink and a dusting of white powdered sugar from the patchki directly onto my cheek. I froze. I was sitting in a high-end Bloomfield Hills law office with a smeared multi-million-dollar contract blue ink on my hand and powdered sugar on my face. It was the most imperfect, messy, ungraceful moment possible. The absurdity of the situation finally broke me. I let out a sound that was half sob and half laugh. It was a wet, exhausted noise that bubbled up from deep inside my chest. The laugh grew louder, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. I covered my face with my clean hand, laughing until tears pricked the corners of my eyes. Gable did not look annoyed. He did not ask his paralegal to print a fresh copy of the document. He looked at the smeared signature, the powdered sugar on my face, and the exhausted relief radiating from my posture. "The signature is perfectly legally binding, Ms. Penelope," he said gently. "The smear simply adds character. The trust is officially executed. The funds are yours to manage." Emma leaned over and grabbed a paper napkin from the bakery box. She handed it to me. "You have sugar on your nose, Mom," she said, her voice filled with quiet, unconditional affection. I took the napkin and wiped my face. I looked at the girl sitting next to me, the girl who had chosen me over a pristine life funded by dead man money, the girl who grounded me when I was terrified I was failing. I was not a scared teenager anymore. I was a mother who had just secured her daughter life against impossible odds. We stood up from the leather chairs. I shook Gable's hand, thanking him for his tedious, brilliant work navigating the federal audit. We walked out of the office, leaving the grease-stained bakery box and the smeared legal documents on the mahogany desk. We rode the silent elevator down to the lobby and stepped out into the thawing Michigan afternoon. The fortune was secure, but the money itself did not instantly fix the deep emotional wounds inflicted by the custody battle. As we walked across the wet parking lot toward my rusted sedan, I knew that navigating this new reality required establishing strict boundaries to protect our newfound peace. I had a multi-million-dollar bank account, but I still needed to decide where we were actually going to live, how we were going to move forward, and what I was going to do about the mother and sister who had tried to destroy us. The legal war was won, but the lifelong process of healing was just beginning. If you gained access to millions of dollars overnight, what is the very first thing you would do? Would you buy a flashy new life to prove to the people who doubted you that you finally won? Would you purchase sports cars, diamond watches, and sprawling estates to mask the insecurities you carried for a decade? Or would you just use the money to finally feel safe in the life you already have? When the probate court officially transferred the funds into the accounts I managed, I did not go on a luxury shopping spree. I did not book a first-class flight to a tropical island. The very first thing I did was drive my rusted sedan to a local bank branch and sit down with a fiduciary planner. I set up a locked educational trust for Emma. I signed the paperwork, ensuring that her college tuition, her housing, and her future medical needs were permanently shielded from any outside interference. It felt surreal transferring a seven-figure sum into a protected account, knowing the child sitting next to me would never have to take out a predatory student loan or work a graveyard shift just to afford textbooks. The next step was finding a place to live. I contacted a real estate agent and gave her a strict, modest budget. She tried to show me gated properties in affluent neighborhoods, assuming the new wealth meant I wanted to live among the local elite. I turned them all down. I did not want a palace. I wanted a sanctuary. We found it in a quiet, tree-lined suburb south of Macomb County. It was a sturdy, three-bedroom brick ranch built in the 1970s. It had a fenced backyard, a renovated kitchen with practical countertops, and it sat within the boundaries of a highly rated public school district. It cost a fraction of what the trust could afford, but when I stepped onto the polished hardwood floors of that empty house, I experienced a profound sense of relief that no luxury mansion ever could provide. The house was paid for in cash. There was no mortgage. There were no looming property taxes I could not afford. Nobody could threaten to foreclose on it, and nobody could ever use it as leverage to force me into submission. People often expect stories involving sudden fortunes and bitter family disputes to end with a grand, tearful reconciliation. Society conditions us to believe that shared blood requires endless forgiveness. They expect the estranged relatives to gather around a holiday table, having learned their moral lessons, smiling over a roasted turkey while uplifting music swells in the background. That is not how trauma works in the real world. I chose a different path. I chose to enforce hard, unyielding boundaries. I changed my phone number. I blocked all incoming email addresses associated with Grand Rapids and my extended family. I heard the details of their fallout through Arthur, my family lawyer, who kept an ear to the ground regarding the probate case. The Internal Revenue Service moved with their usual clinical efficiency. They seized Brenda House, auctioning it off to cover the vast sum of back taxes and punitive penalties she accrued over 12 years of hoarding the hush money. My mother moved into a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city. She took a job working the front desk at a local dental clinic to pay off her remaining debt. Jessica's husband saw his political ambitions crumble. Rumors of his messy family court battle and his attempt to use a secret teenage daughter to secure corporate voting shares circulated quietly among the union leaders. He lost his state Senate primary election by a wide margin. The polished, pristine image Jessica had sacrificed her own child to protect was permanently tarnished. I did not reach out to offer them financial assistance. I did not visit my mother in her new apartment. I refused to offer the neat, perfect family ending they probably expected. I had spent 12 years setting myself on fire to keep them warm, and I refused to hand them the matches ever again. Prioritizing my own mental health and protecting Emma meant walking away from the people who had viewed our survival as a transactional game. But a multi-million-dollar bank account is a financial shield, not a time machine. The money did not magically cure my deep-seated resentment. It did not erase the memory of the high school acceptance letter I tore into pieces when I was 15 years old. It did not give me back my missed prom, the college experience I never had, or the carefree 20s I spent auditing medical claims in the dead of night. I quickly learned that outrunning poverty does not mean you instantly outrun the habits of survival. During our first week in the new house, I found myself standing at the kitchen sink, pouring water into a half-empty bottle of dish soap to make it last longer. I stopped staring at the plastic bottle in my hands, realizing I had thousands of dollars sitting in a checking account, and I was still acting like I was 2 days away from a utility shutoff. Sometimes I still wake up at 3 a.m, my chest tight with a phantom panic, convinced the heat is about to be turned off, or an eviction notice is being taped to my front door. Healing from a decade of profound financial and emotional abuse will take years of dedicated therapy. Wealth buys you the quiet, safe space to process your grief, but it does not do the grieving for you. I accepted that I was not fully healed. The scars were permanent, but they no longer dictated my daily choices. We packed the last of our belongings into cardboard boxes on a brisk Tuesday morning. I did not hire an expensive moving company. Emma and I carried the boxes out to the driveway ourselves. We loaded them into the trunk of my rusted 10-year-old sedan. I planned to buy a safer, reliable vehicle eventually, but for today, the old sedan felt right. It had carried us through the freezing winters, the late-night pharmacy runs, and the desperate drives to the courthouse. It seemed fitting that it would carry us out of Macomb County one last time. I closed the trunk and walked around to the driver's side. The cold morning air smelled of melting snow and wet pine needles. I climbed into the driver's seat and put the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, whining in its usual protest, before turning over and settling into a steady hum. Emma sat in the passenger seat wearing a thick wool sweater. She strapped her seatbelt across her chest and looked straight ahead. The tension that used to grip her small shoulders was gone. The pervasive fear of being a burden, the anxiety of not knowing where she belonged, It had all melted away over the past few weeks. I shifted the car into gear and pulled out of the driveway of the drafty duplex for the very last time. I did not look back at the peeling vinyl siding or the cracked concrete porch. We merged onto Interstate 75, driving south toward our new suburb. The highway was clear. The gray slush of the Michigan winter was finally giving way to the early signs of spring. The heater blew warm air against our legs. The radio was playing softly in the background, tuned to a classic Detroit Motown station. The rhythm was steady and comforting. I kept my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. I glanced up at the rearview mirror, meeting my own tired eyes. The dark circles were still there. The faint lines of exhaustion had not magically smoothed out. I was a flawed 27-year-old woman carrying a heavy load of imperfect memories. Emma reached her hand across the center console. She did not ask for permission. She simply turned the volume dial on the radio up a few notches, letting the soulful music fill the quiet space inside the car. She leaned her head back against the headrest and looked out the window, watching the highway signs pass by. I looked at the road stretching out in front of us. The crushing, suffocating fear of poverty was gone. The legal ghost that had haunted my existence was banished. We were safe. I let out a long, slow breath. The tight knot in my chest finally loosened. I smiled. It was not a brilliant cinematic grin. It was an imperfect, tired smile of a woman who had fought a bitter, grueling war and walked away with the only prize that actually mattered. I pressed my foot gently on the gas pedal, driving us south, finally owning my own life. I sit at the kitchen island of our new brick ranch, watching the morning sun spill across the polished hardwood floors. The house is quiet save for the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of Emma packing her backpack in the next room. There are no past due notices taped to the front door. There is no looming threat of a foreclosure or a political custody battle. We are safe. But arriving at this quiet morning required walking through 12 years of fire. Sitting here holding a warm mug of coffee, I realized that surviving my mother greed and my sister ambition fundamentally rewired how I view the world. I paid a heavy price for my education in human nature, but the curriculum left me with 5 undeniable truths. First, wealth secures the perimeter, but it does not rebuild the foundation inside. The trust fund bought us a house and shielded Emma from the crushing weight of poverty. But money is just a tool. It does not erase the trauma of a stolen youth or cure the instinct to water down soap. Healing requires time therapy and the daily conscious choice to stop living in survival mode. Second family is a verb, not a biological guarantee or a legal technicality. Jessica shared half her DNA with Emma, and my mother wielded the power of an unfiled court document. But true kinship is forged in the grueling, unglamorous trenches of everyday life. It is the midnight pharmacy runs the parent-teacher conferences and the willingness to stand between a child and the people who view her as a commodity. Third, enforcing hard boundaries is the highest form of self-respect. Society demands that we forgive toxic relatives simply because we share a bloodline. I learned that walking away from the people who orchestrated your suffering is not an act of cruelty. Refusing to offer my mother a neat cinematic reconciliation was necessary to protect the peace I fought so hard to build. You do not owe your abusers access to your healing. Fourth understanding, the root of someone's trauma does not excuse their abuse. I understand why the 2008 economic crash terrified my mother. I understand that the fear of homelessness twisted her moral compass and mutated her survival instinct into silent hoarding. But understanding her pain did not obligate me to set myself on fire to keep her warm. You can pity a broken person without letting them drag you down with them. Finally, you cannot wait for someone else to hand you the pen to write your own future. For over a decade, I played the role of the silent, compliant victim because I thought I had no other choice. But the moment I stopped waiting for permission, audited the financial records, and stood my ground in that courtroom, I reclaimed my narrative. You have to advocate for yourself, even if your voice cracks and your hands shake. If my journey resonated with you, I want you to remember that you possess the strength to rewrite your own story. You do not have to accept the role someone else assigned to you. Thank you for listening to my story and walking through this journey with me. If you found value in these lessons and want to hear more stories about reclaiming power and setting unbreakable boundaries, please subscribe to Olivia Stories Revenge. Drop a comment below and tell me which of the 5 lessons hit closest to home for you. Stay strong, protect your peace, and never apologize for owning your own life.